I imagine a single flame, flickering in the darkness of a cave, tens of thousands of years before this moment. The light is small, barely strong enough to push back the shadows, and yet it changes everything, because in that fragile glow humanity begins to see. There is something about light that feels older than memory, older than language, something woven into the very fabric of what it means to gather, to shelter, to make a space our own. And tonight, I find myself tracing that golden thread backward through time, following the soft illumination that has guided us from ancient hearths to the glowing screens that surround us now. The story begins, as so many human stories do, with fire, long before there were cities or farms or written words. There were people sitting in circles around flames, watching the dance of light against stone walls, seeing their own shadows move like spirits in the flickering amber glow. And in those moments, in those first deliberate kindlings of controlled fire, something profound was happening. We were learning to extend the day, to carve out islands of visibility in an otherwise impenetrable night. I picture those early gatherings, the Neolithic people huddled close to their fires, not just for warmth, but for the simple miracle of being able to see one another's faces after the sun had fallen below the horizon. The fire was not merely practical, it was transformative. It turned caves into homes, clearings into sacred spaces, and darkness into something that could be negotiated, managed, even conquered in small and precious increments. The flames would have been fed with whatever wood was dry enough to catch, tended carefully through the long hours, because letting the fire die meant returning to absolute darkness, a darkness so complete that we, who live in a world saturated with artificial light, can barely imagine its weight, its presence, its totality. And so the first interior lighting was not a technology in the way we think of technologies now. It was a relationship, a constant conversation between fuel and flame, between human intention and the wild element that had to be coaxed, maintained, respected. As I follow this thread forward, I see how that relationship evolved, how people began to experiment, to innovate, to find new ways of capturing and carrying light into their shelters, the discovery that animal fat could burn, that certain stones held oil that would feed a flame, that rushes dipped in tallow could be carried from place to place. Each of these revelations opening new possibilities, new freedoms. I imagine a hand reaching for a hollowed stone filled with rendered fat, a wick of twisted plant fiber drawing the fuel upward into a small, steady flame, and suddenly light becomes portable, movable, something that can be placed exactly where it's needed. On a ledge, beside a workspace, near the entrance of a dwelling, the ancient world begins to glow, one small lamp at a time. There is a patience to this history, a slowness that mirrors the very flames it describes, because for thousands upon thousands of years, the fundamental nature of interior lighting barely changed. Fire remained fire, whether it burned in a hearth or a clay lamp or a bronze vessel, whether it consumed wood or oil or wax. The principle was the same: combustion, the transformation of matter into light and heat, a kind of everyday alchemy that our ancestors understood in their bones. I think about the rhythm of those ancient evenings, the way light shaped the hours after sunset, how it drew people together, how it defined the boundaries of the known and the unknown, the illuminated and the shadow, and how In that interplay, entire cultures found their shape. Because light has never been neutral, it has always been a choice, a statement about what matters, what deserves to be seen, what spaces are worthy of extension into the night. And so, as I stand at this moment in time, surrounded by switches and bulbs and glowing devices, I feel a strange kinship with those first fire tenders, because we are all still in our own way trying to push back the darkness, trying to create spaces where we can see and be seen, trying to make our interiors reflect something essential about who we are and how we want to live. The story of interior lighting, I am discovering, is not really about technology at all. It is about the human need to continue, to persist, to find ways of making the night habitable. And in that need, there is something tender, something worth following, lamp by lamp, century by century, all the way from those first cave fires to the soft glow that surrounds us now. The earliest lamps were barely lamps at all. They were accidents that became intentions, discoveries that transformed into traditions. Somewhere in the vast sweep of the Paleolithic, perhaps 40,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, someone noticed that animal fat, when it pooled in the depression of a stone and caught a spark, would burn with a steadier flame than wood alone. And that observation, simple as breathing, changed the nature of human shelter forever. These first lamps were nothing more than shallow bowls of stone, naturally formed or crudely hollowed, filled with whatever rendered fat could be collected from the hunt. Seal blubber in the frozen north, the tallow of deer and auroch in the temperate regions, and into this fuel a strip of dried moss or twisted plant fiber would be laid, drawing the oil upward through capillary action, feeding a flame that could last for hours. I imagine the light they cast, warm and orange, dancing with every breath of air that moved through the cave mouth, throwing shadows that seemed alive, that moved independent of the people who cast them. And in that unstable glow, the painted animals on the cave walls must have seemed to breathe, to run, to hunt across the stone canvas as the flame wavered and swelled. The lamp was not merely practical, it was ceremonial, sacred even, because it allowed people to penetrate deep into the earth, to carry light into chambers where sunlight had never reached, where the darkness was so complete it had weight and texture. And there, in those deepest places, they painted, they gathered, they performed whatever rituals bound them to the world beyond the everyday. Archaeologists have found these lamps, hundreds of them scattered across Europe and Asia, simple objects that speak of sophisticated understanding, the stones chosen carefully for their ability to hold heat without cracking, the wicks positioned just so, the fuel managed with precision born of necessity. And as the millennia turned, as the ice retreated and the climate warmed, as people began to settle in one place and cultivate the earth, the lamp evolved. The Neolithic Revolution brought pottery, and with pottery came new possibilities for containing light. Clay vessels could be shaped specifically for burning, with spouts to hold the wick, with handles for carrying, with lids to protect the flame from drafts. And suddenly, the lamp became a designed object, something crafted with intention, decorated with the same patterns that adorned the storage jars and ceremonial vessels in the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture first took root, where mud brick homes began to cluster into villages. Interior lighting became a daily concern rather than an occasional need, because now there were rooms, true interior spaces that required illumination after dark, workshops where pottery was painted and cloth was woven, gathering spaces where families shared meals and stories. The oil lamp of the ancient Near East was a marvel of simple engineering, a shallow bowl with a pinched rim to hold the wick in place, filled with olive oil or sesame oil, burning with a clear, bright flame that produced remarkably little smoke. These lamps could be made by the thousands, stamped from molds, decorated with geometric patterns or images of gods and animals, and they were everywhere, in homes and temples, in palaces and market stalls. I think about the light they provided, how it must have transformed the experience of evening, how it extended the hours of productivity, allowed for gathering after the day's labor was done, created a space for conversation and community that didn't depend on the sun's schedule. The ancient Egyptians refined the oil lamp even further, creating vessels of alabaster and bronze, of gold and silver for the wealthy, of simple clay for everyone else. They used castor oil and linseed oil, balanos oil from the desert shrub, and their lamps burned in temples and tombs, in the homes of scribes and craftsmen, casting light across hieroglyphic texts and delicate paintings. But the Egyptians also developed something else, something that would become equally important to the history of interior lighting. The candle. The first candles were not like the smooth pillars of wax we know today. They were rushlights, the pithy core of rush plants, peeled and dried and then dipped repeatedly in animal fat until they were coated thick enough to burn. These humble lights were used by common people throughout the ancient world because they were cheap, easy to make, and required no vessel to contain them. The Romans, great innovators of practical technology, took the candle and transformed it. They discovered that beeswax, when melted and poured around a wick, created a candle that burned brighter and cleaner than tallow, that produced a pleasant scent rather than the acrid smell of burning fat, and most importantly, that didn't drip and sputter the way tallow candles did. But beeswax was expensive, a luxury reserved for temples and the homes of the wealthy, and so the common people continued to use tallow, rendered from beef or mutton fat, poured into molds, or dipped repeatedly until the candle reached the desired thickness. And these candles, smoky and imperfect as they were, lit the long Roman nights, illuminating the insulae where workers lived, the workshops where trades were practiced, the taverns where wine was drunk and dice were thrown. The Romans also perfected the oil lamp, creating designs so elegant and efficient that they would remain essentially unchanged for 1,000 years. Terracotta, lamps with closed tops and small filling holes, multiple wick holes for brighter light, handles for carrying, chains for hanging. They mass-produced these lamps in enormous quantities, stamping them with maker's marks and decorative scenes, exporting them across the empire from Britain to Mesopotamia. I imagine a Roman household at evening, oil lamps burning in niches along the walls, perhaps a bronze lamp stand in the atrium, casting light across the mosaic floor. The family gathered for the evening meal, servants moving through the rooms with hand lamps, their flames reflecting off the painted walls, the whole space alive with shifting light and shadow. And in the public spaces, the forums and basilicas, the baths and theaters, larger lamps and braziers burned, extending civic life into the hours of darkness, allowing commerce and conversation to continue, creating a nightlife that would not be seen again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. But the fall of Rome brought darkness, literally and metaphorically. As the empire collapsed, as trade routes failed and cities emptied, as the sophisticated infrastructure of Roman civilization crumbled, the quality of interior lighting declined, the elegant oil lamps disappeared, replaced by cruder vessels, simpler technologies, and in many places people returned to the rushlight, to the tallow candle, to lighting methods that would have been familiar to their ancestors 1,000 years before. The medieval period is sometimes called the Dark Ages, and while that term is too simple, too dismissive of the genuine achievements of the era, it is true that for most people, the nights were darker than they had been under Rome. That artificial light was more precious, more carefully rationed, that the hours after sunset were largely given over to darkness and sleep. In the great halls of nobles, tallow candles burned in iron sconces, and on special occasions in great iron candelabras that held dozens of lights. But even for the wealthy, light was expensive enough that it was used sparingly. Servants would snuff the candles when rooms were empty, collect the drippings to be remelted and used again, guard the stores of tallow and wax like treasure. In monasteries, where the religious life demanded vigils through the night, where manuscripts had to be copied and prayers recited in the hours before dawn, candles and oil lamps burned more freely, but even there, the cost was felt, recorded in account books, carefully managed by the cellarer who oversaw the monastery's resources. The common people, the peasants who made up the vast majority of the population, had even less. A single rushlight might be all that stood between a family and complete darkness, and that light would be used sparingly, lit only when necessary. Extinguished as soon as the needed task was complete, because fuel, whether tallow or oil or even the rushes themselves, represented time and resources that could be ill afforded. I think about those medieval nights. How dark they must have been. How completely the world beyond the small circle of firelight or candlelight must have disappeared. How the night was a different country, vast and unknowable, and how that shaped the medieval imagination, populated the darkness with spirits and demons, made the boundary between day and night feel like a passage between worlds. And yet, even in that darkness, innovations continued. The development of the candle lantern, a simple frame of wood or metal with panels of horn or oiled linen, meant that a candle could be carried outdoors without guttering in the wind, could be hung in a stable or workshop without fear of starting a fire, could provide light in places where an open flame was too dangerous. And the slow improvement of candle-making techniques, the development of better wicking materials, the discovery that adding certain substances to tallow could reduce smoke and improve the burn, these small advances accumulated, making artificial light slightly more efficient, slightly cleaner, slightly more reliable, and in certain places, particularly in the Islamic world, which had maintained and built upon Roman knowledge while Europe struggled through its dark centuries, the art of lighting advanced considerably. Persian and Arab craftsmen created oil lamps of astonishing beauty and sophistication, pierced brass vessels that cast intricate patterns of light and shadow, enameled glass lamps that glowed with color when lit, hanging lamps with multiple tiers, each holding several wicks, creating cascades of light in mosques and palaces. The mosque lamp became an art form unto itself, often featuring verses from the Quran worked in gold and enamel, suspended on chains from the ceiling, filled with precious oils, casting a light that was meant to be both practical and symbolic, a reminder of divine illumination, of the light of faith dispelling the darkness of ignorance. These innovations would eventually make their way back to Europe, carried along trade routes, brought back by crusaders, slowly influencing the development of lighting in the West. But that transmission took time, centuries, and for most people in medieval Europe, the night remained largely unconquered, a time of darkness punctuated by small, precious points of light. The Renaissance brought light in more ways than one. As trade revived and cities grew wealthy on commerce, as knowledge flowed back from the Islamic world and the rediscovered texts of antiquity, as craftsmen organized into guilds and began to innovate with new confidence, the quality and availability of interior lighting began to improve, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The chandelier emerged as a statement of wealth and power. Great wheels of wood or iron suspended from the ceiling, holding dozens of candles, their light multiplied by reflection from polished metal surfaces. These were not merely functional objects. They were displays of abundance, proof that the owner could afford to burn so many candles at once, that they could flood a room with light in defiance of the darkness and the expense. In Venice, where glass-making had become an art of legendary sophistication, craftsmen on the island of Murano began creating chandeliers of blown glass, delicate and fantastical, with arms like frozen water, with drops and pendants that caught and scattered the candlelight, transforming a single flame into a constellation of glittering points. These Venetian chandeliers would become symbols of luxury, exported across Europe to palaces and great houses. Their light refracted through crystal into rainbows. But for most people, even prosperous merchants and professionals, lighting remained a significant household expense. Candles had to be purchased or made, wicks had to be prepared, lamps had to be filled and cleaned, and the cost in both money and labor was considerable. The tallow chandler became an essential tradesman in every city, rendering animal fat, adding wax when it could be afforded, dipping wicks again and again into the hot liquid until candles of the proper size had been built up. It was messy work, malodorous work, and cities relegated chandlers to specific districts where the smell would cause less offense, but their product was essential, as necessary to urban life as bread or water. Beeswax remained the premium choice, but it was expensive enough that its use was largely confined to churches and the homes of the very wealthy. The Catholic Church was one of the largest consumers of beeswax candles, burning them by the thousands on altars and in processions, their clean flame and sweet scent considered appropriate for sacred use, and the production of beeswax became intertwined with monastic life, with the keeping of bees, with the cycle of the liturgical year. The Protestant Reformation brought changes even to lighting, as reformers stripped churches of what they considered excessive ornamentation, as the emphasis shifted from visual splendor to the word. The use of candles in religious settings became a point of theological debate, and in some Protestant countries, the demand for beeswax declined, shifting resources toward domestic and civic lighting instead. The 17th century saw the development of new lamp designs, particularly in the Netherlands, where the wealth generated by trade and the distinctive architecture of Dutch homes, with their large windows and well-lit interiors, created both the means and the desire for better artificial lighting. Dutch inventors experimented with lamps that used a cylindrical wick holder, that drew oil more efficiently, that could be adjusted to control the brightness of the flame. These improvements were incremental, small refinements that made lamps burn a bit brighter, use fuel a bit more efficiently, produce a bit less smoke, but over time, these increments added up to significant progress. The Betty lamp, developed in Germany and widely used in colonial America, was a simple but effective design, a shallow covered vessel with a wick holder that could be adjusted. It burned fish oil or whale oil more efficiently than earlier designs, and it could be hung from a hook or set on a surface, providing flexible lighting for working households. But the real transformation in interior lighting began in the 18th century, as scientific inquiry turned its attention to the chemistry of combustion, to the physics of flame, to the practical problem of creating better light. The argand lamp, invented by the Swiss chemist Ami Argand in 1783, was revolutionary. It used a hollow circular wick that allowed air to pass through the center of the flame as well as around the outside, dramatically improving combustion efficiency, combined with a glass chimney that controlled the draft and protected the flame. The argand lamp produced a light that was steady, bright, and remarkably clean burning. For the first time, a lamp could produce light comparable to multiple candles, but using less fuel and producing less smoke. The impact was immediate. Argand lamps were adopted in homes and businesses across Europe and America. They lit the salons where the Enlightenment conversed late into the night, the workshops where craftsmen worked by improved light, the libraries where scholars pored over books without straining their eyes. I imagine the experience of that brighter light, how it must have felt to people accustomed to the dim flicker of candles and simple oil lamps. Suddenly rooms could be genuinely well lit. Work could continue with less eye strain. Reading became easier, more pleasant. The circle of usable light expanded, and the fuels themselves were improving. Whale oil, rendered from the blubber of sperm whales, burned cleaner and brighter than previous lamp oils. The whaling industry, brutal as it was, supplied the oil that lit America and Europe through the early 19th century. Great ships sailed from Nantucket and New Bedford, pursuing whales across the world's oceans, and the oil they brought back was refined and sold, filling the lamps that burned in parlors and counting houses, in taverns and theaters. Candles, too, were advancing. In 1825, a French chemist named Michel-Eugène Chevreul discovered how to separate the components of tallow, extracting stearine, which could be molded into candles that were harder, whiter, and cleaner burning than traditional tallow. Stearic acid candles became the new standard, affordable enough for middle-class households, superior to tallow in every way. And then, in 1850, paraffin wax was developed from petroleum, and candles took another leap forward. Paraffin was even cheaper than stearin, even cleaner burning, and it could be produced in enormous quantities as the petroleum industry developed. Suddenly, good quality candles were available to almost everyone. The soft white light of paraffin candles became the standard domestic lighting, present in homes of every class. But even as candles reached their apex, they were about to be superseded. Coal gas, a byproduct of heating coal to produce coke for iron smelting, had been observed to be flammable since the 17th century, but it was not until the beginning of the 19th century that entrepreneurs realized it could be captured, piped, and used for lighting. The first gas lighting systems appeared in factories, where the investment in infrastructure could be justified by the long hours of operation, by the need for reliable light that didn't require constant tending. William Murdoch, a Scottish engineer, installed gas lighting in a cotton mill in 1798, and the age of piped lighting had begun. London began installing gas streetlights in 1812, and the technology spread rapidly. Gas companies formed, laying pipes beneath city streets, selling gas to businesses and wealthy households, and the nature of urban lighting changed fundamentally. Gas light was brighter than oil lamps, more convenient than candles. It could be turned on and off with a valve. It didn't require trimming or refilling. It transformed the experience of evening in cities. Streets became safer, shops could stay open later, theaters and music halls blazed with light, and gradually, as the technology became cheaper and the infrastructure more extensive, gas lighting moved into middle-class homes. I think about what it must have been like to install gas lighting in a home for the first time, to turn a valve and watch light bloom from the fixture, steady and bright, requiring no more attention, no more lamp filling or wick trimming or candle changing. The convenience alone was remarkable, but it was more than that. It was a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with interior light. For the first time in history, light was becoming a utility, something that could be assumed rather than carefully managed, something that flowed into homes through pipes the way water did. And that shift, subtle as it might seem, represented a profound change in daily life. The gas chandelier became the new status symbol, ornate fixtures with multiple arms, each ending in a gas jet, often supplemented with argon burners for even brighter light. These fixtures were works of art, cast in bronze or brass. Decorated with glass shades and crystal pendants, they hung in the dining rooms and parlors of the prosperous, casting a light that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. But gas had its drawbacks. It consumed oxygen, requiring good ventilation. It produced heat, making rooms stuffy. It created soot, blackening ceilings and walls, and it was dangerous. Leaks could cause explosions. Faulty fixtures could start fires. The smell of gas became a familiar and ominous presence in Victorian homes. Still, for several decades, gas was the pinnacle of interior lighting technology. Cities vied to build the most extensive gas networks. Homes were marketed on the basis of having gas laid on, and the soft hiss of gas jets became the soundtrack of evening in the developed world. And then, almost simultaneously, two new technologies emerged that would change everything, that would bring interior lighting into the modern age, that would make light so abundant, so cheap, so ubiquitous, that it would cease to be something people thought about at all. The kerosene lamp, developed in the 1850s, used a refined petroleum product that burned cleaner and brighter than whale oil. With none of the supply limitations, kerosene lamps, using improved burners based on Argon's principles, provided excellent light at a fraction of the cost of gas, and because they required no infrastructure, they brought good lighting to rural areas, to farms and frontier towns, to anywhere oil could be shipped. For a brief period, kerosene lamps represented the democratic ideal of lighting, affordable, portable, effective. They lit the American frontier, the European countryside, homes and businesses across the world, and they remain in use today in places without electrical infrastructure, a technology over a century and a half old, still serving its original purpose, but the future belonged to electricity. The electric light did not arrive suddenly. Despite what mythology suggests, Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb in a flash of singular genius. Rather, electric lighting emerged from decades of experimentation, from the work of dozens of inventors across multiple countries, each building on the discoveries of those who came before. Arc lamps came first, as early as the 1830s, using the brilliant light produced when an electric current jumped between two carbon electrodes. But arc lamps were too bright, too harsh, too expensive for domestic use. They found their place illuminating lighthouses and theaters, public squares and factories, great spaces that needed intense light and could absorb the cost. The challenge was to create a gentler electric light, something that could replace the gas jet in homes and offices, and that required solving the problem of incandescence, heating a filament to the point where it glowed, but doing so in a way that the filament wouldn't immediately burn up in the presence of oxygen. Joseph Swan in England, Thomas Edison in America, and others in France and Germany all worked on this problem through the 1870s, experimenting with different filament materials, different vacuum techniques, different bulb designs, and gradually, through systematic trial and error, they found solutions that worked. Edison's breakthrough came in 1879, using a carbonized bamboo filament in an evacuated glass bulb. The filament glowed for hours, producing a warm, steady light that was gentle enough for reading, bright enough to illuminate a room, and with continued refinement, electric bulbs began to last for hundreds of hours, long enough to be practical, economical, revolutionary. But a light bulb without electricity is merely a curiosity. And what Edison and his rivals understood was that electric lighting required an entire system: generators to produce power, wires to distribute it, meters to measure consumption, fixtures to hold the bulbs, switches to control them, and most importantly, a business model that would convince people to abandon their gas lights and invest in this new technology. Edison built the first commercial power station in New York in 1882, serving a small district in lower Manhattan, and suddenly, for the first time, buildings could be lit by electricity supplied from a central source. The model was proven, and the race was on to electrify the world. The transition was not immediate. Gas companies fought back, improving their own technology, reducing prices, arguing that gas was safer, more reliable, and for a time, the two technologies coexisted. Many buildings had both gas and electric lighting, hedging their bets, using each where it seemed most appropriate. But electricity had advantages that could not be overcome. It was cleaner, producing no soot or fumes. It was safer, with no open flame, no combustion, no oxygen consumption. It was more convenient, controlled by a simple switch rather than a valve and match, and most importantly, it was flexible. Electric current could power not just lights, but motors, appliances, an entire suite of technologies that would transform domestic life. By the 1890s, electric lighting was spreading rapidly through cities. Street lights were converted from gas to electric. Businesses installed electric lights to attract customers. Theaters and department stores blazed with unprecedented brilliance, and the nighttime city became a spectacle of light, a phenomenon that still defines urban life today. The early electric bulbs produced light that was warm and slightly amber, similar in quality to candlelight or gaslight, a color temperature that felt familiar, comfortable, and as the technology improved, as tungsten filaments replaced carbon in 1906, the light became brighter, whiter, more efficient, lasting thousands of hours instead of hundreds. I imagine the wonder of those early adopters, flipping a switch and watching light bloom instantly. No match to strike, no wick to trim, no waiting for the gas to flow and ignite. Just immediate, clean, silent illumination. It must have felt like magic, like something out of the future suddenly made present. The light bulb became an icon, a symbol of innovation and progress, the very image of having a good idea. And in a remarkably short time, it became ubiquitous. By the 1920s, most urban homes in America and Europe had electric lighting. The infrastructure had been built, the cost had come down, and an entire generation was growing up for whom the flip of a switch was the most natural thing in the world. Rural electrification took longer. Farms and small towns remained dependent on kerosene lamps and candles well into the 20th century, but government programs in the 1930s, particularly in America, brought power lines into the countryside, and the experience of finally getting electric lights, after decades of watching cities glow in the distance, was often described as transformative, life-changing, a leap into modernity. With abundant electric light came new possibilities, new ways of designing interiors, new rhythms of daily life. Suddenly it was easy to light an entire house, every room bright and welcoming, and the old patterns of gathering in one well-lit room while the rest of the house remained dark began to dissolve. The 20th century became a playground for lighting innovation, recessed lights that disappeared into ceilings, track lighting that could be aimed and adjusted, spotlights that created drama and emphasis. And with each innovation, interior spaces became more sculptured by light, more deliberately illuminated. Fluorescent lighting arrived in the 1930s, using an electric discharge through mercury vapor to produce ultraviolet light, which then excited a phosphor coating on the tube to emit visible light. Fluorescent tubes were remarkably efficient, producing far more light per watt than incandescent bulbs, and they found immediate application in offices and factories, stores and schools, anywhere that needed bright, economical lighting. But the quality of fluorescent light was different, cooler, more blue-green than the warm amber of incandescent, and many people found it harsh, unflattering, institutional. It became associated with workplaces rather than homes, with fluorescent-lit offices becoming a symbol of modern white-collar labor, vast open floors illuminated by rows of humming tubes overhead. The mid-century modern movement embraced artificial lighting as an element of architectural design, creating buildings where light was integral to the space, where windows and electric fixtures worked together to create specific moods and effects. Architects like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe thought carefully about how light would interact with their spaces, both natural and artificial, creating interiors where lighting was as important as any other design element. The 1960s and 70s brought halogen lamps, which used a halogen gas to allow the tungsten filament to burn hotter and brighter without degrading, producing an intense white light that was perfect for task lighting. For reading and detailed work, halogen desk lamps became ubiquitous in offices, their bright pools of light enabling the close work that characterized information age labor. Track lighting and recessed cans allowed homeowners to create gallery-like lighting in their own homes to spotlight artwork or architectural features, to create layered lighting schemes with ambient, task, and accent lighting all working together. Interior lighting had become sophisticated, intentional, a craft in its own right. The dimmer switch arrived, allowing people to control not just whether lights were on or off, but how bright they should be, creating the possibility of mood lighting, of adjusting illumination to activity and preference. And with it came a new awareness of light as something that could be modulated, shaped, used expressively. And then, at the turn of the 21st century, LED technology matured, light-emitting diodes that produced light through electroluminescence rather than heat, using a fraction of the energy of incandescent bulbs, lasting not thousands but tens of thousands of hours, and capable of producing any color of light through mixing different wavelengths. LEDs were not new. They had existed since the 1960s as small indicator lights, but it took decades of development before they could produce enough light to serve as general illumination. And when they finally could, they represented another revolution, as significant as the transition from gas to electric. LED bulbs use so little energy that leaving lights on becomes almost negligible in terms of cost. They produce almost no heat. They last so long that changing bulbs shifts from a regular household chore to a rare occurrence. And they can be controlled digitally, dimmed, colored, programmed, integrated into smart home systems that adjust lighting automatically based on time of day or occupancy. The quality of LED light has improved dramatically. Early LEDs produced harsh, blue-tinged light that many people found unpleasant, but modern LEDs can replicate the warm glow of incandescent bulbs, or produce cool daylight, or shift smoothly between different color temperatures throughout the day, mimicking the natural progression of sunlight from dawn's warm tones through midday's brightness to evening's amber fade. Smart lighting systems now allow for scenes and schedules, for lights that gradually brighten to wake you in the morning, that shift to warmer tones in the evening to promote relaxation, that can be controlled from anywhere via smartphone, that respond to voice commands or motion sensors. Lighting has become not just a utility, but a responsive environment, something that adapts to our needs and preferences with minimal conscious intervention. And yet, for all this technological sophistication, there remains something compelling about older forms of light. Candlelight still graces dinner tables, creates atmosphere in restaurants, marks ceremonies and celebrations, not for its practical value, but for its quality, the way the flame moves, the warmth of its glow, the ancient associations it carries. The same is true of incandescent bulbs, which are being phased out in many countries for efficiency reasons, but which many people mourn, preferring their warm, continuous spectrum light to even the best LED imitations. There is something in us that responds to the light of heat, of combustion, of technologies that connect us, however tenuously, to those first fires in ancient caves. The history I have been tracing, from fire to LED, spans something like 50,000 years, and across that vast sweep of time, the fundamental human desire has remained constant. The wish to extend the day, to push back the darkness, to create spaces where we can see and be seen, where work and community can continue beyond the sun's schedule, but the means have transformed utterly from the carefully tended fire that required constant attention to the switch and the voice command that summon instant illumination. And in that transformation lies a story not just of technology, but of how we live, how we think about our spaces, how we structure our time, how we relate to the natural cycles of light and dark. We have arrived at a curious place in this history, a moment where light has become so abundant that we barely notice it, where the flip of a switch or the tap of a screen summons illumination without thought, without effort, without any sense of the tremendous journey that made such casual abundance possible. And in that abundance, something has been gained, and something, perhaps, has been lost. The gain is obvious. We live in a world where darkness is optional, where we can work and read and move about our homes at any hour, where the night no longer dictates our activities, where eye strain and accidents from poor lighting are increasingly rare, where even the poorest households in developed countries have access to lighting that would have astounded royalty a few centuries ago. But the loss is more subtle, more difficult to articulate. It has to do with our relationship to the natural world, to the cycles of day and night that governed human life for nearly all of our existence as a species. We have conquered darkness so thoroughly that many of us, especially those who live in cities, never experience true darkness at all. The night sky, washed out by light pollution, our circadian rhythms disrupted by the ability to maintain bright light at any hour. I think about what we have traded, the convenience and safety of abundant light, for a certain intimacy with darkness, with the night itself. There was a time when darkness was a presence, something known, something that shaped consciousness and culture, when the night had its own character, its own rules, and when the transition from day to night was a threshold that mattered. Now the threshold has dissolved. Day and night blend seamlessly. We work night shifts under fluorescent brightness. We scroll through phones in bed, bathing our faces in blue light. We can make it perpetually noon inside our homes if we choose, and in doing so, we have stepped outside the rhythm that governed our ancestors' lives, the pattern of light and dark that our bodies evolved to expect. The candle, which served humanity for thousands of years, has become decorative, atmospheric, something we use to create a mood rather than to see by, and in that shift from necessity to luxury, from function to symbol, lies the entire transformation of human experience. Electric light liberated us, but it also severed us from a kind of attentiveness that scarcity required when light was precious, expensive, difficult to maintain. People thought carefully about when and where to use it. They gathered together in the lit spaces. They planned their activities around the availability of light. They maintained a relationship, however unconscious, with the cost of pushing back the darkness. Now we leave lights burning in empty rooms without a second thought. We illuminate entire buildings through the night, though no one is there. We create sky glow so intense that children grow up without ever seeing the Milky Way. And we do this because we can, because light has become cheap enough, abundant enough, that we no longer calculate its cost. But perhaps there is value in remembering, in understanding that the casual flip of a switch represents the culmination of 50,000 years of human ingenuity, that the light bulb overhead contains within it the dreams of countless generations who huddled around fires, who trimmed wicks, who rationed candles, who worked by dim and flickering light because it was all they had. The history of interior lighting is, in a sense, the history of human aspiration, the desire to transcend our limitations, to extend our control over our environment, to refuse to be bound by the sun's schedule. And that aspiration has been remarkably successful. We have achieved a level of illumination that would seem miraculous to people from any previous era. And yet, there is wisdom in the old ways too, in the understanding that darkness has its place, that rest and activity need different qualities of light, that the rhythm of day and night serves purposes deeper than mere convention. Modern sleep science tells us what our ancestors knew intuitively, that exposure to bright light, especially blue-rich light, in the evening disrupts our sleep, that our bodies need darkness to produce melatonin, that the perpetual brightness of modern life comes with costs to our health and well-being. Perhaps the future of lighting lies not in ever greater brightness, but in greater subtlety, in systems that adapt to our biological needs, that provide bright blue-white light when we need alertness, warm amber light when we need to wind down, that dim and shift throughout the evening, helping rather than hindering our natural rhythms, technology in service of well-being rather than mere capability. The candle still has something to teach us, not as a practical source of light, but as a reminder of what light can be: gentle, warm, alive, imperfect, a presence rather than merely a utility. And perhaps that is why we still light candles on birthday cakes and dinner tables, why we still gather around fires when we can, seeking something that electric light, for all its advantages, does not quite provide. There is a quality to natural light, to firelight and candlelight, and even to the warm glow of incandescent bulbs, a continuous spectrum, a relationship to heat and combustion that speaks to something old in us, something that recognizes and responds to light as we knew it for most of our history. The story comes full circle, from fire to fire, because even our most advanced LED systems now try to mimic the qualities of firelight, the warmth, the ability to dim, the color that shifts toward amber as the light lowers. We have traveled an enormous distance technologically only to try to recreate, through sophisticated electronics, something like the light that danced on cave walls 50,000 years ago. And in that circle, there is a kind of poetry, a recognition that progress is not always linear, that moving forward sometimes means recovering something we left behind, that the newest technology can honor the oldest wisdom. The lights around us now, wherever we are, contain multitudes. They are the descendants of those first flames, the inheritors of centuries of innovation, the product of countless minds working to solve the simple problem of how to see in the dark. And when we understand that lineage, when we trace that golden thread backward through time, even the most ordinary light switch becomes a kind of miracle. I find myself thinking about all those nights, stretching back through history, people sitting by whatever light they could muster, talking, working, dreaming, finding ways to continue beyond the sunset, and how that simple persistence, that refusal to let darkness end the day, led eventually to the illuminated world we inhabit now. The journey from cave fire to LED is the journey of human civilization itself, our endless creativity, our determination to improve our condition, our willingness to build on what came before, and our ability to make the extraordinary become ordinary, to transform what once seemed like magic into everyday reality. And so the lights burn on in homes and offices, in streets and buildings, across the world, a testament to ingenuity, to progress, to the deep human need to see and be seen, to gather in the light, to continue, to persist, to make our mark upon the darkness. The glow is everywhere now, so constant that we forget to notice it. And perhaps that is the greatest achievement of all, that we have made light so abundant, so reliable, so ordinary, that we can take it for granted, that we can focus on what the light reveals rather than on the light itself. But every now and then, it is worth pausing, worth looking at the light around us with fresh eyes, with awareness of all the centuries and all the innovations that made this moment possible. Worth remembering that what seems simple, the flip of a switch, the voice command that summons brightness, is actually the culmination of an epic human endeavor. The flame still flickers in memory, in the warmth of well-designed light, in the candles we still sometimes light, connecting us across the vast span of time to those first fire tenders, those first lamp makers, those first people who decided that darkness could be challenged, that night could be negotiated, that human beings could make their own light, and in doing so, could extend the possibilities of what it meant to be alive, to be awake, to be present in the world beyond the sun's decree. And with that thought, the story gently fades, like light dimming slowly, like embers cooling, like the soft transition from illumination to darkness that we have fought against for so long, but which in the end remains a natural and necessary part of the rhythm of existence, the balance, the breath, the endless cycle of light and dark and light again. I can see the light shifting through the window now, golden and amber, falling across the edge of a wooden desk where glass slides rest in careful rows, each one thin as a whisper, each one holding something invisible to the naked eye, something that exists in a dimension just beyond what we can perceive without help, without magnification, without the patiental-chemy of stains and dyes that render the hidden world suddenly, unmistakably visible. There is something about this hour, this particular quality of fading daylight, that makes the laboratory feel less like a place of rigid methodology and more like a sanctuary, a cathedral built for the contemplation of smallness, of structures so minute they border on the philosophical cells, those fundamental units of life that Robert Hooke first named centuries ago when he peered through his crude compound microscope at a thin slice of cork and saw chambers, rooms, little boxes that reminded him of monastery cells where monks would retreat in solitude. The word stuck, became permanent, became the foundation of an entire branch of knowledge that would come to be called cytology, from the Greek kaitos, meaning container or vessel, and logos, meaning study or word, the study of containers, the study of vessels that hold within them all the machinery of existence, all the instruction, all the subtle mechanisms that differentiate a liver cell from a neuron, a plant cell from an amoeba drifting through pond water. Tonight the microscope sits ready, its brass fittings catching that amber light, reflecting it back in soft gleams, and there is something almost ceremonial about approaching it, about placing a slide onto the stage, about adjusting the mirror beneath to catch whatever illumination remains, to channel it upward through the glass, through the specimen, through the carefully ground lenses that will magnify what cannot otherwise be seen. Cytology is not simply the observation of cells, though observation is where it begins, where it must always begin. It is the gradual piecing together of a narrative that unfolds at a scale measured in micrometers, in thousandths of a millimeter. It is detective work conducted in a realm where the evidence is translucent, where structures must be coaxed into visibility with chemical persuasion, where patience is not merely a virtue, but an absolute requirement. The slides arranged here on the desk, they tell stories, each one prepared with meticulous attention, tissue sliced impossibly thin, fixed to preserve what would otherwise decay, stained to distinguish one component from another, nucleus from cytoplasm, chromatin from the pale matrix surrounding it. And when light passes through these preparations, when the eye settles against the eyepiece and the focus knob turns slowly, slowly, bringing clarity where there was only blur, something remarkable happens. The boundary between observer and observed grows thin. There is a kind of intimacy in studying cells, in coming to recognize their architecture, the way certain stains will bind to certain structures, the way a nucleus appears dense and dark with hematoxylin, the way cytoplasm takes up eosin and glows pink under the light. These are not arbitrary facts, but rather the visual language through which cytology communicates, through which it allows us to read the text written in tissues, in organs, in the very fabric of organisms, and perhaps what draws people to this field. What has drawn generations of researchers to spend hours bent over microscopes in laboratories, much like this one, is not merely curiosity about biological mechanisms, though that is certainly present, but something deeper, a recognition that in studying cells, we are studying the most fundamental expression of what it means to be alive, to be organized, to be capable of growth and division and response. A single cell can be an entire organism, complete unto itself, carrying out all the functions necessary for survival within the compass of its membrane, or it can be one voice in a chorus of trillions, specialized, interdependent, part of a complex system where liver cells and muscle cells and neurons all perform their distinct roles while remaining, at the most essential level, variations on a common theme. The history of cytology is the history of seeing more clearly, of developing new techniques to render visible what was previously hidden, of asking better questions as each answer revealed new layers of complexity. And tonight, in this quiet laboratory with its amber light and careful arrangements of slides and stains and cover slips, it feels possible to trace that history, to follow the thread backward through decades and centuries, to understand how knowledge accumulated, grain by grain, observation by observation, until the cell revealed itself not as a simple container, but as a universe of intricate structures and processes, each one essential, each one worthy of a lifetime study. The microscope waits, and beyond it, stretching back through time, are all the minds that looked through similar instruments and saw and wondered and recorded what they found. The story begins, as so many stories of science do, with someone looking closely at something others had overlooked, with someone willing to spend hours preparing and examining specimens that most would dismiss as unremarkable. And in the case of cytology, the story begins with fabric and cork and the magnifying instruments of the 17th century, crude by modern standards, but revolutionary in their time, opening doors into dimensions that had existed always, invisibly, waiting for the right combination of curiosity and technology to reveal them. Robertus Hooke, working in London in the year 1665, published his Micrographia, a volume filled with exquisite illustrations of what he had observed through his compound microscope, insects rendered in startling detail, the compound eye of a fly, the structure of a feather, and there, among these observations, a drawing of cork, thin slices of it magnified to show a honeycomb pattern, little chambers separated by walls, and he called them cells, celluli, after the small rooms where monks lived in monasteries, never knowing that this casual naming would echo through centuries, would become the foundational term for an entire branch of biology. But Hooke was seeing only the walls, the empty chambers left behind after the living contents had dried and vanished. He was observing the architecture of plant tissue, the cellulose frameworks, not the living substance within, not the protoplasm that actually constitutes the vital material of life. That understanding would come later, would require different eyes and different techniques. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch tradesman with an extraordinary talent for grinding lenses, was peering through his simple microscopes at samples of water and blood and scrapings from his own teeth, and in 1674 and the years following, he began documenting creatures he called animalcules, tiny beings swimming through pond water, bacteria from his mouth, the structure of blood, red corpuscles, and his letters to the Royal Society described these observations with wonder and precision, describing movement and form at scales no one had properly documented before. These early observers, Hooke and Leeuwenhoek and others working in that revolutionary century, they were not yet cytologists in the formal sense. They were natural philosophers armed with new instruments, explorers of the microscopical world, but they were laying groundwork, establishing that there existed an entire realm of structure and life beyond the threshold of unaided human vision, a realm that would demand new vocabulary, new methods, new ways of thinking about the organization of living things. The 18th century saw refinements in microscope design, improvements in lens grinding, but progress in understanding cellular organization came slowly. Microscopists could observe, could describe, could draw what they saw, but interpretation remained challenging. Specimens were difficult to prepare properly. Illumination was uneven, and the theoretical framework for understanding what cells actually were and how they functioned simply did not exist yet. It was not until the early decades of the 19th century that the study of cells began to coalesce into something resembling a unified discipline. And this coalescence depended on several developments occurring in parallel. Better microscopes with improved achromatic lenses that reduce color distortion, better preparation techniques for preserving tissue, and most importantly, a growing number of observers who began to recognize patterns, to see that the cellular architecture Hooke had noted in cork appeared, with variations, across an enormous range of plant and animal tissues. The botanists led the way in many respects. Plant cells with their rigid walls were easier to observe, easier to section and examine, and in 1838, Matthias Jakob Schleiden, a German botanist, published his conclusion that all plants were composed of cells, that the cell was the fundamental unit of plant structure. This was not entirely original. Others had noticed the ubiquity of cells in plant tissue, but Schleiden stated it clearly, forcefully, made it a principle rather than an observation. The following year, 1839, Theodor Schwann, a physiologist who had studied under the influential Johannes Müller, extended this principle to animals. He had been examining animal tissues, noticing that despite their greater variety and seeming complexity, they too showed cellular organization, and he published his treatise declaring that all living things, both plants and animals, were composed of cells. That cellular structure was universal, a common feature linking all organisms. This was the birth of cell theory, one of the great unifying principles of biology, and it marked the true beginning of cytology as a distinct field. No longer were cells merely interesting structures to be noted and catalogued. They were now understood as fundamental, as the basic units from which all living things were constructed. And this recognition changed everything, changed the questions researchers asked, changed the direction of investigation. But cell theory in its early form was incomplete. Schleiden and Schwann both held mistaken ideas about how new cells arose. They believed in a kind of crystallization process, thought that cells could form spontaneously from unstructured material, from what they called the cytoplasma, a formative substance from which cells would precipitate like crystals forming in a solution. This was wrong, profoundly wrong, but it was an honest attempt to explain something they could not yet properly observe, the actual process of cell division. Rudolf Virchow, another German physician and pathologist, recognized the error, and in 1855 he published his famous dictum, Omnis cellula e cellula, every cell from a cell. Cells did not arise spontaneously. They arose only through the division of pre-existing cells. This principle, simple as it sounds, had profound implications. It meant that there was an unbroken chain of the cellular continuity stretching back through time, that every cell in every organism today was descended from cells that had divided and divided and divided through countless generations, back to the very origin of life itself. Virchow's work also established pathology, the study of disease on a cellular foundation. He recognized that disease was not some vague corruption of bodily humors, not a spiritual imbalance, but rather a consequence of cellular malfunction, of cells behaving abnormally, dividing when they should not, dying when they should persist, failing to perform their specialized functions. This cellular pathology became a cornerstone of modern medicine, and it demonstrated the practical importance of cytology, its relevance beyond pure scientific curiosity. With cell theory established, with the recognition that cells divided to produce new cells, attention turned to the details, to understanding what cells actually contained, how they were organized internally. And here the limitations of early microscopy became apparent. Living cells viewed under the microscope appeared largely transparent. Structures within them were barely visible. The nucleus might be glimpsed as a slightly denser region, but details were maddeningly elusive. The solution came through chemistry, through the development of dyes and staining techniques that would selectively bind to different cellular components, rendering them visible, distinguishing them from their surroundings. And this chemical revolution in microscopy transformed cytology, turned it from a discipline limited to observing external form into one capable of exploring internal architecture. Carmine, derived from cochineal insects, proved useful for staining nuclei. Hematoxylin, extracted from logwood, also showed an affinity for nuclear material. And aniline dyes, products of the burgeoning chemical industry of the mid-19th century, offered a rainbow of colors that could be used to differentiate structures: methylene blue, eosin, safranin, each binding preferentially to different components, each revealing aspects of cellular organization that had been invisible before. Walther Fleming, working in the 1870s and 80s, used these new staining techniques to observe cell division in extraordinary detail. He studied salamander larvae, thin sections of their tissues fixed and stained, and he watched through sequential observations of different cells caught at different stages as thread-like structures appeared in the nucleus, condensed, aligned themselves, and then separated as the cell divided into two daughters. He called the material chromatin because it took up color from the stains so readily, and he called the process mitosis, from the Greek word for thread, mitos, describing the thread-like appearance of the structures he observed. These chromosomes, as they would later be named, were clearly important. They appeared in every cell division, went through the same elaborate dance of condensation and separation, ensuring that each daughter cell received an identical complement. But what they were, what they contained, what role they played beyond simply being duplicated and distributed during division remained mysterious, tantalizing, a puzzle that would occupy researchers for decades to come. The late 19th century was a golden age for cytology. Microscope technology had matured, staining techniques were being refined and standardized, and a generation of talented observers was documenting cellular structure with unprecedented precision. Atlases of tissue types appeared, showing the characteristic appearance of liver cells and muscle cells and neurons and epithelial cells. Medical students learned to recognize cellular pathology, to identify disease by the appearance of cells under the microscope. Edward Strasburger studied plant cell division, noting that plants too showed the same mitotic process, the same careful segregation of chromosomes. Oscar Hertwig observed fertilization in sea urchin eggs, watched as sperm nucleus and egg nucleus fused, recognized that both male and female contributed equally to the genetic material of the offspring, that the nucleus, and specifically the chromosomes within it, must carry hereditary information. This connection between cytology and heredity became increasingly apparent as the 19th century drew to its close. Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance in pea plants, published in 1866 but largely ignored for decades, would be rediscovered in 1900. And suddenly cytologists realized that the chromosomes they had been observing and documenting so carefully were likely the physical carriers of Mendel's hereditary factors, that the behavior of chromosomes during cell division and during the formation of sex cells could explain the patterns of inheritance Mendel had described mathematically. Walter Sutton and Theodore Boveri, working independently in the early years of the 20th century, made this connection explicit, proposed what became known as the chromosome theory of inheritance, the recognition that genes, whatever they were at the molecular level, were located on chromosomes, that the segregation of chromosomes during the formation of eggs and sperm could account for Mendel's laws, that cytology and genetics were not separate disciplines but intimately connected. Two approaches to understanding the same fundamental phenomena, the study of cells, had come so far. From Hooke's empty chambers in Cork, from Leeuwenhoek's animalcules, to a sophisticated understanding of cellular division, of chromosome behavior, of the connection between cellular structures and heredity. And yet, in many ways, the journey was just beginning, because knowing that chromosomes carried hereditary information was not the same as knowing what chromosomes were made of, not the same as understanding the molecular mechanisms by which they functioned. Those questions would require new techniques, new instruments, new ways of probing cellular structure at ever finer scales. But here, in these foundational decades, cytology had established itself, had proven its importance, had revealed that the invisible world within cells was rich with structure and meaning, and the light falling through the laboratory window now seems softer still, as if the accumulated weight of all these observations, all these careful drawings and stained preparations and published papers, has somehow made the present moment more substantial, more connected to that long history of looking closely, of asking what lies beneath the surface, of finding universes in drops of water and thin slices of tissue. The 20th century arrived with a sense of momentum, a feeling that the tools and concepts were finally adequate to the task of truly understanding cellular life, and the laboratory became a place of increasing sophistication, where chemistry and biology merged, where physics contributed insights about light and resolution, where the boundaries between disciplines grew permeable because the questions being asked demanded knowledge from multiple domains. The microscope itself evolved. Compound microscopes with oil immersion lenses could now resolve structures separated by as little as 0.2 of a micrometer, revealing details that earlier observers could never have glimpsed, and researchers learned to exploit the wave nature of light, to use different wavelengths, to adjust illumination techniques, to enhance contrast, to make visible the nearly invisible, dark field microscopy, where specimens were illuminated from the side so that only scattered light reached the objective lens, turned cells into glowing objects against black backgrounds, made it possible to see living cells, moving, changing, without the deadly fixing and staining that had been necessary before. Mitochondria could be observed in living cytoplasm, thread-like structures that moved and changed shape, and researchers began to suspect that these were not merely structural elements, but sites of cellular activity, places where something energetically important was happening. Phase contrast microscopy, developed by Fritz Zierneich in the 1930s, exploited differences in refractive index within cells, converting variations in how much light was slowed by different cellular components into variations in brightness, and suddenly living cells revealed their internal architecture without any staining at all. Nuclei appeared distinct. The boundaries between cell and environment grew sharp, and the dynamic nature of cellular life became observable in real time. But observation alone, even with these improved techniques, could not answer the deeper questions. What were cells made of? What chemical processes sustained them? How did the structures visible under the microscope actually function? And so cytology increasingly incorporated biochemical approaches, breaking cells open, separating their components, analyzing their chemical composition. The technique of differential centrifugation, refined in the 1930s and 40s by Albert Claude and others, allowed researchers to fractionate cells, to spin them in a centrifuge at different speeds, causing different cellular components to pellet out based on their size and density. Nuclei first, then mitochondria, then smaller particles, then the soluble contents of the cytoplasm, and each fraction could be analyzed separately, its chemical composition determined, its enzymatic activities measured. Claude and his colleagues George Palade and Christian de Duve, working at the Rockefeller Institute, pioneered the cell fractionation approach, and they discovered that the cell was not a simple bag of uniform protoplasm, as earlier microscopists had sometimes imagined, but rather a highly compartmentalized structure with different regions specialized for different functions. Mitochondria turned out to be the powerhouses of the cell, sites where nutrients were oxidized and energy captured in chemical form. Lysosomes were bags of digestive enzymes capable of breaking down unwanted materials. The endoplasmic reticulum was a vast network of membranes where proteins were synthesized and processed. The electron microscope, developed in Germany in the 1930s and gradually refined and adopted by biologists in the 40s and 50s, changed everything once again, because unlike light microscopes, which were limited by the wavelength of visible light to resolving structures no smaller than about 2/10 of a micrometer, electron microscopes used beams of electrons with wavelengths thousands of times shorter and could therefore resolve structures thousands of times smaller. Suddenly, the internal architecture of cells appeared in astonishing detail. Membranes that had been barely visible with light microscopy now showed structure, revealed themselves as double layers, lipid bilayers with embedded proteins. The mitochondria that had appeared as threads or granules in light microscopes were revealed to have elaborate internal membrane systems. Cristae folded back and forth across their interiors, increasing surface area, providing sites for the molecular machinery of energy production. The nucleus was no longer just a dark staining blob, but showed internal organization. The chromosomes were visible in their uncondensed state as chromatin, scattered throughout the nuclear volume, and the nucleolus appeared as a distinct region, rich in RNA, where ribosomes, the cellular machines responsible for protein synthesis, were being assembled. Keith Porter and George Palade, working with these new electron microscopes in the 1950s, produced images that were simultaneously beautiful and revelatory. They showed cells as cities, complex three-dimensional structures with organelles like buildings, with membrane systems like roads connecting different districts, with molecular trafficking happening constantly, proteins being synthesized here, modified there, packaged and shipped to their destinations, a logistics operation of staggering complexity operating within a space measured in micrometers, and the membranes themselves, which had once seemed like simple barriers, revealed themselves as dynamic interfaces, studded with proteins that acted as channels and pumps and receptors, controlling what entered and left, responding to signals from outside the cell, participating in communication between cells. The cell membrane was not passive but active, constantly working to maintain the interior environment, to keep concentrations of ions and molecules at appropriate levels to respond to changes in the external world. The study of chromosomes, cytogenetics, flourished during these decades. Researchers learned to arrest cells in the middle of division, to spread out their chromosomes, to stain them in ways that revealed banding patterns unique for each chromosome, allowing individual chromosomes to be identified. And this proved medically important because errors in chromosome number or structure could now be detected, could be correlated with diseases. Down syndrome was shown in 1959 to result from having 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of the normal 2. Other syndromes were traced to missing or rearranged chromosomes. And suddenly, cytology became diagnostic. A karyotype, a picture of a person's complete chromosome set, could reveal genetic abnormalities, could explain developmental problems, could guide medical decisions. The connection between cytology and molecular biology grew stronger as the structure of DNA was elucidated in 1953 by Watson and Crick. Building on the X-ray crystallography work of Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins, the double helix explained how genetic information could be stored, how it could be copied, and cytologists realized that the chromosomes they had been studying for decades were essentially long DNA molecules, packaged with proteins, coiled and supercoiled to fit inside the nucleus. The chromosome was not a simple structure, but a marvel of organization. The DNA in a single human cell, if stretched out, would measure about 2 meters long, yet it had to fit inside a nucleus only a few micrometers in diameter, and it had to remain accessible, capable of being read by the cellular machinery, capable of being replicated accurately when the cell divided. The packaging was therefore dynamic, constantly being reorganized, loosened here to allow a gene to be expressed, tightened there to keep other genes silent. Autoradiography became a powerful technique. In the 1950s and 60s, cells were fed radioactive precursors, tritium-labeled thymidine, that would be incorporated into newly synthesized DNA, or radioactive amino acids that would be incorporated into proteins. And then photographic emulsion was laid over thin sections of the tissue, and wherever radioactive decay occurred, it would expose the emulsion, creating a dark grain. And by counting grains, researchers could determine where synthesis was happening, could watch as DNA replicated during S phase of the cell cycle, could track proteins as they moved from their sites of synthesis to their final destinations. The cell cycle itself, that fundamental rhythm of growth and division, became understood in molecular detail. Cells spent most of their time in interphase, growing, carrying out their specialized functions. And during this period, the chromosomes were decondensed, spread throughout the nucleus as chromatin, accessible to the enzymes that would transcribe genes into RNA. Then came S phase, synthesis phase, when the entire genome was replicated, every DNA molecule copied so that each chromosome became 2 sister chromatids joined at a centromere. And this replication was extraordinarily accurate, with proofreading mechanisms that kept errors to about 1 mistake per billion base pairs copied. Because errors in DNA replication could become mutations, could be passed on to daughter cells, could accumulate over time, after S phase came G2, a gap phase where the cell prepared for mitosis, synthesized the proteins needed for cell division, checked that DNA replication was complete, and then came mitosis itself, that elaborate choreography that Fleming had first observed, prophase when chromosomes condensed, metaphase when they aligned at the cell's equator, anaphase when sister chromatids separated and moved to opposite poles, telophase when nuclear envelopes reformed around each set of chromosomes, and finally cytokinesis when the cytoplasm divided, creating two daughter cells. And all of this was controlled, regulated by protein complexes called cyclins and cyclin-dependent kinases that rose and fell in concentration, that acted as checkpoints, ensuring that one stage was completed before the next began, preventing division if DNA was damaged, stopping the cycle if something went wrong, and when these controls failed, when cells divided despite damage, despite signals telling them to stop, the result was cancer, uncontrolled proliferation, cytology turned pathological. The study of cancer cells under the microscope revealed characteristic changes, nuclear enlargement, altered nuclear to cytoplasmic ratios, prominent nucleoli, abnormal mitotic figures, and pathologists learned to grade tumors based on these cytological features to predict how aggressive a cancer might be, to guide treatment decisions. The microscope remained, even in an age of molecular biology, an essential diagnostic tool. Immunocytochemistry emerged as a technique in the 1970s and 80s, using antibodies labeled with fluorescent dyes to mark specific proteins within cells, and suddenly it became possible to ask where particular proteins were located, whether they were in the nucleus or cytoplasm, whether they were concentrated in particular organelles, whether their location changed in response to signals, and cells viewed under fluorescence microscopes became maps with different colors marking different molecular territories. The cytoskeleton was revealed through these fluorescent techniques, actin filaments forming networks near the cell surface, providing structural support, enabling cell movement, microtubules radiating from centrosomes near the nucleus, serving as tracks along which motor proteins carried cargo, intermediate filaments providing mechanical strength, and the cell was suddenly understood not as a soft bag of liquid, but as a structured space with internal organization, with highways and scaffolding, with dynamic architecture that could be remodeled in response to need, cell culture techniques, growing cells outside the body in controlled conditions, allowed cytologists to study living cells over time, to watch them move, divide, differentiate. Cells could be grown on glass cover slips and observed continuously. Time-lapse microscopy captured hours or days of cellular behavior, compressing it into minutes of viewing, revealing patterns invisible to static observation. And the questions grew more sophisticated. How do cells know where they are? How do they communicate with neighbors? How do they decide whether to divide or differentiate or die? And cytology merged with developmental biology, with immunology, with neuroscience, because all of these fields ultimately came down to understanding what cells were doing, how they responded to signals, how they organized themselves into tissues, how they specialized to perform particular functions while retaining, at some deep level, the fundamental characteristics of all cells, The laboratory now contains equipment that would have seemed magical to those early microscopists. Fluorescence microscopes with multiple laser lines, confocal microscopes that can optical section through living tissue, electron microscopes that can achieve near atomic resolution, and yet the fundamental activity remains the same, looking closely, preparing specimens with care, asking what these structures mean, how they function, how they relate to the great questions of life and death and heredity and disease. The revolution in molecular biology that began in the latter decades of the 20th century did not replace cytology, but rather transformed it, enriched it, provided tools to answer questions that had lingered since those first observations of chromatin and mitosis, and the cell became understood not just as a structural unit, but as an information processing system, reading its genetic instructions, responding to environmental signals, making decisions about fate and function through intricate molecular networks. Recombinant DNA technology, emerging in the 1970s, allowed researchers to manipulate genes to insert foreign DNA into cells, to tag proteins with fluorescent markers. And suddenly, cytology could be experimental in new ways. A protein of unknown function could be fused to green fluorescent protein, originally isolated from jellyfish, and its location within the cell would glow green under appropriate illumination. Its movements could be tracked, its interactions with other cellular components observed in living cells. This fusion of molecular biology and cytology created what might be called molecular cytology, where the goal was not just to describe cellular structures, but to understand them mechanistically, to know not just that mitochondria existed, but to identify every protein in their membranes, to understand how those proteins worked together to generate cellular energy, to see how mitochondrial dysfunction led to disease. The Human Genome Project, completed in the early years of the 21st century, provided a complete inventory of human genes, approximately 20,000 of them, each encoding a protein or RNA molecule with specific functions, and cytologists could now ask systematic questions. Where in the cell is each protein located? When during the cell cycle is each gene expressed? How do proteins interact to form functional complexes? How are these interactions regulated? Flow cytometry became a standard technique, allowing researchers to analyze thousands of cells per second, sorting them based on fluorescent markers, separating populations, determining what fraction of cells in a sample were dividing, what fraction showed markers of differentiation or death, turning cytology into a quantitative science where statistical analysis of large populations could reveal patterns invisible when examining cells one by one. Single-cell sequencing technologies, developed in the 2010s, pushed this even further, making it possible to determine which genes were active in individual cells, to see that cells that looked similar under the microscope might actually be quite different in their molecular profiles, that there was hidden diversity within tissues, subtypes, and intermediate states that had been invisible to traditional cytological examination. The brain, that most complex of organs, revealed itself to contain not just a few cell types, but dozens, hundreds, each with characteristic patterns of gene expression, each contributing to neural circuits in specific ways, and cytology helped map this complexity, helped identify cell types, helped trace their developmental origins, helped understand how neurons and Galilea worked together to process information and store memories and generate consciousness. Super-resolution microscopy techniques, developed in the early 21st century and recognized with a Nobel Prize in 2014, broke through the diffraction limit that had constrained light microscopy for centuries. Stimulated emission depletion microscopy, photoactivated localization microscopy, structured illumination microscopy, each using different clever approaches to achieve resolution approaching tens of nanometers, resolving structures that had previously required electron microscopy, but doing so in living cells with multiple colors over time. And the cell revealed even finer details: the organization of proteins within membranes, the structure of synapses where neurons communicated, the arrangement of DNA and proteins in chromosomes, the architecture of the nuclear pore complexes that controlled traffic between nucleus and cytoplasm, each one a marvel of molecular engineering. Hundreds of proteins assembled with nanometer precision, cryo-electron microscopy, where specimens were frozen so rapidly that ice crystals did not form, preserving cellular structures in near-native states, allowed researchers to determine the three-dimensional structures of large protein complexes, to see ribosomes in atomic detail, to understand how molecular machines actually worked, and cytology merged with structural biology, with biophysics, with computational modeling, because understanding cells required integrating knowledge across scales, from atoms to molecules, to organelles, to whole cells, to tissues. The concept of the cell itself became more nuanced, more complex. Cells were not isolated units, but nodes in networks connected to neighbors through gap junctions that allowed direct cytoplasmic continuity, through adherens junctions and tight junctions that sealed tissues, through chemical signals that diffused between cells or traveled through the bloodstream. And cytology had to become systems biology, had to consider not just individual cells, but populations, communities, multicellular organisms as societies of cells working together. Stem cell biology emerged as a major field, focused on cells that retained the capacity to divide indefinitely and to differentiate into multiple cell types. Embryonic stem cells that could become any cell in the body, adult stem cells that maintained and repaired specific tissues, and cytologists studied what made stem cells special, what molecular signatures distinguished them, what signals caused them to differentiate, how they could be manipulated for therapeutic purposes. The technique of induced pluripotency, developed by Shinya Yamanaka in 2006, showed that differentiated cells could be reprogrammed, that skin cells could be converted back to a stem-like state by expressing just 4 transcription factors. And this fundamentally changed how cytologists thought about cell identity. It was not fixed, not permanent, but rather maintained by active gene regulatory networks, networks that could be disrupted and reset. Cancer cytology evolved beyond simple microscopic examination. Genomic analysis of tumor cells revealed that cancer was fundamentally a disease of cellular information, mutations accumulated in genes controlling cell division, DNA, repair, death, and these mutations cause cells to ignore normal regulatory signals, to proliferate inappropriately, to evade immune surveillance, to metastasize, and treatment increasingly targeted specific molecular abnormalities identified through cytological and molecular analysis, liquid biopsy techniques, analyzing circulating tumor cells or cell-free DNA in blood, extended cytology beyond solid tissues, allowed monitoring of cancer without invasive procedures, and the cell became a diagnostic window, its contents revealing disease states, its molecular profile guiding personalized medicine. Organoids, three-dimensional cell culture systems where cells self-organized into structures resembling miniature organs, provided new models for studying development and disease. Intestinal organoids with crypts and villi, brain organoids with layered structures reminiscent of cortex, and cytologists could watch as cells interacted, as they responded to gradients of growth factors, as they organized themselves according to intrinsic programs, revealing principles of morphogenesis that had been difficult to study in living embryos. The advent of CRISPR gene editing in the 2010s, allowing precise modification of DNA sequences, turned every cell into a potential experiment. Genes could be knocked out, mutations introduced, sequences altered, and the effects on cellular behavior observed. Cytology became interventional, active, manipulating cells to test hypotheses about gene function, about cellular mechanisms, about disease processes. And yet, despite all these technological advances, despite the molecular detail now available, the microscope remained central because cells had to be seen, their behavior observed, their responses to perturbations documented visually. And there was something irreducible about looking, about the practiced eye recognizing abnormality, about the aesthetic judgment involved in preparing beautiful specimens, in choosing the right staining protocol, in adjusting illumination to reveal what needed to be seen. The laboratory had become a space where ancient craft traditions intersected with cutting-edge technology, where someone might spend hours perfecting a staining protocol handed down through generations of cytologists, and then analyze the results with artificial intelligence algorithms, where hand sectioning of tissue coexisted with automated microscopy systems that could image entire slides at high resolution, where intuition and quantification complemented rather than replaced each other. Teaching cytology remained important. Medical students still learned to identify cell types, to recognize pathology, because automated systems, however sophisticated, could not yet match the integrative judgment of a trained human observer. And there was something valuable in that education, in learning to see, to notice subtle variations, to understand that categories like epithelial cell or fibroblast were useful abstractions, but that real cells existed in continuous spaces, showed variation, responded to context. The history of cytology was the history of seeing more, of developing techniques to reveal what was hidden, but it was also the history of interpretation, of building frameworks to make sense of observations, of recognizing that new tools required new concepts, that better microscopes were not enough without better theories, and the field had been shaped by brilliant observers, by people willing to spend years studying particular cell types, by those who saw patterns others missed, by instrument makers and stain chemists and theoreticians, all contributing to a collective enterprise. And now, in this current moment, cytology stood at another transition. Artificial intelligence was beginning to analyze microscopy images, to identify features, to make diagnoses, to predict outcomes based on cellular morphology, with accuracy sometimes exceeding human experts. And there were questions about what this meant, whether the human element would remain necessary. whether something would be lost if observation became purely algorithmic. But perhaps what cytology had always been about, what drew people to spend hours at microscopes, was not just the collection of data, but the experience of connection, of bringing the invisible into view, of witnessing the Baroque complexity of life at cellular scale, of recognizing oneself as an assemblage of trillions of these units, each carrying out its specialized role, each containing within its small volume all the molecular machinery necessary for its function. The light through the laboratory window has shifted, has taken on the blue cast of approaching evening, and the slides arranged on the desk seem to hold more weight now, more significance, because they represent not just specimens but moments in the long history of trying to understand what we are made of, what life is at its most fundamental level, and that question, however much has been learned, however many techniques have been developed, however detailed our molecular maps have become, retains its mystery, its capacity to provoke wonder. The deepening happens slowly, like dusk gathering in corners, and what becomes apparent after following this long history, after tracing cytology from cork chambers to cryo-electron microscopy, is that the study of cells has always been the study of boundaries, of interfaces between visible and invisible, between structure and function, between the individual and the collective. And these boundaries are not sharp lines, but gradients, zones of transition where categories blur and something more interesting emerges. A cell membrane is only a few nanometers thick, a lipid bilayer with embedded proteins, yet it separates inside from outside, self from other, and maintains this distinction actively, constantly, using energy to pump ions against their concentration gradients to maintain the internal environment that allows life to continue. And this is perhaps the most fundamental property of cells. They create and maintain difference. They resist equilibrium. They are islands of low entropy in a universe trending toward disorder. When cytologists observe a cell dividing, watch the chromosomes condense and separate, the cytoplasm cleave. What they are witnessing is continuity and change occurring simultaneously. The daughter cells are not identical to the parent. Random variations accumulate, and over time these variations can lead to differentiation, to specialization, to the emergence of new cell types, and ultimately to evolution, to the diversification of life. The cell division observed under a microscope in the present moment connects backward through billions of years of divisions, an unbroken chain stretching to the origin of cellular life. There is something almost meditative about preparing slides, about the careful sectioning of tissue, the gentle handling with forceps, the sequential immersion in fixatives and alcohols and xylenes, the application of stain, the placement of cover slip. Each step requires attention, precision, and the process cannot be rushed. Good cytology demands patience, demands a willingness to repeat procedures until they yield clear results. And in this way, the practice itself teaches something about care, about the relationship between preparation and revelation. The stains that make cellular structures visible work by chemical affinity. Hematoxylin binds to negatively charged components like DNA and RNA. Eosin binds to proteins. And what appears under the microscope is therefore not the cell as it exists, but a representation, a translation of chemical properties into visible color. And yet this representation reveals truth. shows organization that is real, even if the colors are artificial. And there is something worth considering in that, in how we come to know things through instruments and techniques that transform them, that make them accessible to human perception. Mitochondria contain their own DNA, small circular chromosomes, separate from the nuclear genome. And this strange fact, this persistence of genetic independence within cells, supports the endosymbiotic theory, the idea that mitochondria were once free-living bacteria that entered into partnership with early eukaryotic cells billions of years ago. And this means that we are composite beings, not unified organisms, but ecosystems, communities of genetic lineages that have learned to cooperate. And cytology reveals this, shows that even at the cellular level, there is no simple unity, but rather negotiated coexistence. The nucleus with its double membrane, its nuclear pores that control traffic, its organized chromosome territories where each chromosome occupies a specific region of the nuclear volume, represents another kind of boundary between genome and cytoplasm, between information storage and information use, and the cell must constantly manage this boundary, transcribing genes when their products are needed, packaging chromosomes to prevent expression when silence is required, responding to signals that originate outside the cell but must somehow be transmitted to the nucleus to alter gene expression patterns. When cells die, and all cells eventually die unless they transform into cancer, they can do so in different ways. Necrosis is passive, catastrophic. The membrane fails, the cell swells, ruptures, spills its contents, but apoptosis, programmed cell death, is controlled, orderly. The cell dismantles itself from within, packages its components into membrane-bound bodies, displays signals that say, "Remove me," to patrolling immune cells, and this death is necessary, essential for development, for tissue remodeling, for removing damaged or dangerous cells. Cytology shows that death is not merely the absence of life, but an active process, a program written into cellular machinery. The diversity of cell types in a complex organism, hundreds of distinct kinds, each with characteristic morphology and function, all arise from a single fertilized egg, and they all contain the same genome, the same genetic information. What differs is which genes are expressed, which programs are running. And this means that cell identity is about regulation, about gene regulatory networks that maintain particular patterns of expression. And these networks are remarkably stable. A neuron remains a neuron through decades of life, yet they are not absolutely fixed, as induced pluripotency demonstrates. They can be reset, reprogrammed, and this flexibility, this latent potential, even in differentiated cells, suggests something about the nature of identity itself. Cytologists working with time-lapse microscopy sometimes describe a feeling of witnessing intention, watching a cell move toward a chemical gradient, observing the coordinated behavior of cells in a developing embryo. And while we know these behaviors emerge from molecular interactions, from chemical gradients and receptor binding and signal transduction cascades, there remains something uncanny about watching cells behave as if they know what they are doing, as if they have purpose. And perhaps this is not entirely illusion. Perhaps at some level purpose exists even in these simple systems, encoded not in consciousness, but in molecular programs shaped by evolution. the observation that cancer cells look abnormal under the microscope, that they have enlarged nuclei and prominent nucleoli and disordered chromatins. This has been known for more than a century, but what it reflects is that cancer is not just uncontrolled division, but dysregulation of the entire cellular program. Cancer cells have lost the architecture that normal cells maintain. They no longer properly organize their chromosomes, no longer properly separate them during division. And this visible disorder corresponds to molecular chaos, to accumulated mutations, to failed checkpoints. Cytology makes pathology visible, makes disease something that can be seen and therefore studied and potentially treated. There is beauty in well-stained tissue sections, in the regular arrangement of cells in healthy epithelium, in the parallel alignment of muscle fibers, in the elaborate branching of neurons. And this beauty is not arbitrary, not merely aesthetic. It reflects functional organization, the form following from function, and when pathologists examine biopsies, they are reading this language of form, interpreting deviations, recognizing when organization has broken down, when cells have begun to behave abnormally. The microscope becomes a diagnostic instrument because health has a visible signature, and so does disease. The closing comes without announcement, without any sudden shift. It comes the way evening has come to this laboratory, gradually, imperceptibly, until suddenly it is present, and what remains is the microscope still sitting on its bench, the slides still arranged in their careful rows, the staining jars with their jewel-colored contents, all the apparatus of cytology waiting quietly. And outside the window the last light has faded to deep blue, to indigo, to something approaching darkness. There is a particular quality to this hour, when the day's work is finished, but before the evening has truly begun, when the laboratory exists in a state of suspension, and it feels appropriate somehow that this should be when we arrive at the end of this long consideration, this tracing of cytology from its origins to its present moment, because the field itself exists in such a state, poised between past achievements and future possibilities, carrying forward techniques refined over generations, while incorporating tools that would have been inconceivable decades ago. The study of cells continues. In laboratories around the world, researchers are preparing slides, adjusting microscopes, staining tissues, imaging living cells, analyzing data, asking questions about development and disease and the fundamental nature of life. And this work connects them to everyone who has done similar work before, to Hooke and Leeuwenhoek, to Schleiden and Schwann and Virchow, to Fleming and Hertwig, to Claude and Palade, to all the named and unnamed observers who contributed to this accumulated understanding, and perhaps what this history suggests, what the long arc of cytology demonstrates, is that knowledge accumulates slowly through patient observation, through careful technique, through the willingness to look closely at things too small to see without aid, through the recognition that the invisible world matters. That understanding, it changes how we understand ourselves, because we are not single unified beings, but communities, trillions of cells working together, each one carrying out its specialized function while remaining, at its core, recognizably a cell, with membrane and cytoplasm and nucleus, with the capacity to divide, to respond to signals, to maintain itself against entropy. The microscope sits in darkness now, or nearly so, just the faint glow from the window providing enough light to see its outline, its familiar shape. And there is something comforting about this, about knowing that it will be here tomorrow, that slides will be prepared and examined, that cells will be observed, that the work of understanding will continue. Patient, incremental, building toward comprehensions we cannot yet imagine, just as early microscopists could not have imagined electron microscopy or fluorescent proteins or CRISPR gene editing. The slides arranged on the desk. Each one holds tissue sliced thin, fixed, stained, preserved, fragments of organisms that were once alive and now serve as texts to be read as evidence of cellular organization. And in the darkness they are invisible, their contents hidden, waiting for light to pass through them again, for eyes to examine them, for understanding to emerge from observation. And this waiting seems appropriate, seems like a natural place to rest, because cytology is not finished, will never be finished. There will always be more to see, finer details to resolve, new techniques to develop, new questions to ask. The cell in its complexity remains inexhaustible, a universe that can be explored indefinitely. And knowing this, knowing that the work continues, that others will look through microscopes tomorrow and discover things not yet known, is enough. The laboratory is quiet now. The light from the window has faded completely. And in this darkness, the microscope and slides and staining jars exist as potentials, as instruments waiting to be used, as techniques waiting to be applied. And perhaps this is where we should leave them, in this state of readiness, of possibility, knowing that when morning comes, when light returns, the work of seeing will begin again, patient, careful, attentive to the small and hidden things that constitute the foundation of life, the cells that build us, that are us, that continue their quiet work whether observed or not, dividing, differentiating, dying, maintaining the improbable organization we call being alive. And with that thought, with that recognition, the story can rest, can settle into silence, the way darkness has settled into this laboratory, complete, sufficient, needing nothing more. I imagine myself standing in a quiet chamber, a place that exists somewhere between memory and discovery, where the air itself seems to hold the echoes of 10,000 years. The walls around me are neither stone nor wood, but something softer, more yielding, as if they were woven from the fabric of the human longing itself. And in this space, scattered across tables of dark wood and resting in cases lined with velvet, the color of midnight, lie instruments, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, each one a voice waiting to speak. There is a particular quality to the light here, filtered and golden, the kind of illumination that makes everything seem both present and impossibly distant, as though I am looking not just at objects, but at doorways into other times, other civilizations, other ways of understanding what it means to be human. I move slowly, my footsteps making no sound, and I notice first a simple flute, carved from bone, its surface worn smooth by hands that turned to dust millennia ago. There are holes along its length, precise and deliberate, each one positioned with an intention I can almost feel. The bone is the color of old ivory, pale and luminous, and when I lean closer, I can see the faint marks where someone once shaped it, scraping and smoothing, testing the tone, adjusting until the voice that emerged was exactly right. Beside it rests a drum, its frame constructed from wood that has darkened with age, its skin stretched taut across the opening, and even without touching it, I can imagine the sound it would make, that deep, resonant pulse, the heartbeat that must have carried across valleys and echoed between mountains, calling people together, marking the rhythm of dances I will never see, ceremonies I can only dream about. The chamber extends further than I first realized, row after row of instruments emerging from the golden shadows, and each one seems to whisper a question. How did this come to be? What hands first discovered that striking this, or plowing across that, or breathing into this, could produce something that wasn't speech, and wasn't silence, but something else entirely, something that could move through a human body and change the very texture of emotion itself. I think about the first person who ever blew across the edge of a hollow reed and heard that breathy, haunting tone, or the one who stretched an animal's sinew between 2 points and plucked it, discovering that invisible tension could sing. These were not small moments. These were thresholds, crossings from one kind of existence into another. And as I stand here, surrounded by these artifacts of human creativity, I realize that what I'm looking at is not simply a collection of tools for making sound, but a map of human consciousness itself, charting our journey from the caves and forests where we first stood upright, through the rise of cities and empires and the birth of languages both spoken and written, into the vast and varied landscape of cultures that have flowered and faded across every continent. Each instrument here is an answer to the same fundamental question, one that seems to live in the center of what it means to be human. How do we take what is invisible, our joy, our sorrow, our longing, our celebration, and give it form? How do we make the internal external, the private communal, the fleeting permanent? The instruments before me span such distances, not just in miles, but in time, in purpose, in the very conception of what music could be. There are instruments designed for the solitary shepherd on a hillside, and instruments built for vast orchestras in marble halls. There are instruments whose only purpose was to speak to gods, and instruments created purely for the delight of princes, instruments of war and instruments of courtship, instruments to mourn the dead, and instruments to welcome children into the world. And beneath all of this variety, this explosion of form and function across millennia, there runs a single continuous thread, the thread of human hands, human breath, human imagination, taking the raw materials of the earth, wood and bone, metal and hide, reed and stone, and transforming them into vessels for something that cannot be touched, cannot be seen, but can be felt in the deepest chambers of the heart. I find myself drawn deeper into the chamber, into the story these instruments tell, a story that begins in a darkness so profound that almost nothing remains of it except shadows and suppositions, but a darkness that nevertheless gave birth to something that would become as essential to human life as fire, or language, or bread. The story begins in a time so distant that the very landscape of the earth was different, when ice sheets covered regions that are now temperate, when the ancestors of modern humans moved in small groups across vast territories, following game, seeking shelter, surviving, and yet, even then, even in that world of ice and scarcity, there was music. We know this because they left evidence, not written records, for writing would not emerge for tens of thousands of years, but physical objects, instruments carved from the materials at hand, preserved by accident in caves and burial sites, waiting to tell their story to people who would live in an unimaginably different world. The oldest of these, the ones that make archaeologists speak in hushed and wondering tones, are flutes, simple hollow tubes with finger holes, carved from the wing bones of birds, from the ivory of mammoths. And when carbon dating reveals their age, the numbers seem almost impossible. 40,000 years, perhaps more. 40,000 years. A span of time so vast that it contains the entire arc of recorded history many times over, and extends far beyond it into the mists of prehistory. These flutes were crafted with extraordinary care. The holes are positioned with precision, suggesting that the makers understood, perhaps through generations of experimentation, exactly where to place each opening to achieve the desired tones. This was not random. This was knowledge, hard-won and passed down, refined over centuries we can barely conceive. I think about the person who made one of these instruments, sitting perhaps near a fire as darkness gathered, using stone tools to hollow out the bone, to smooth its interior, to mark and drill each hole with patient attention. What were they thinking? What did music mean to them? We cannot know their thoughts, but we can know this. They valued music enough to invest hours of careful labor in creating an instrument. In a world where every moment mattered for survival, where finding food and maintaining warmth and avoiding predators consumed most of each day, they still made time for this, for the creation of something whose only purpose was to produce organized sound. And this tells us something profound about our species, something that distinguishes us in ways that go beyond our physical form or even our capacity for language. We are, and perhaps have always been, makers of music. But the flutes are not alone. Across different sites, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, archaeologists have found other evidence of early music making. They have found scrapers, notched bones or antlers that produce a rasping sound when struck with a stick. They have found what appear to be early percussion instruments, stones selected for their resonant qualities, positioned in ways that suggest deliberate arrangement. In some caves, in France and Spain, there are paintings, images of animals and hunters rendered in ochre and charcoal on stone walls, and researchers have discovered something remarkable. The locations where these paintings appear are often the points in the cave where the acoustics are most dramatic, where a voice or an instrument would resonate and echo, creating an almost supernatural effect. This suggests that our ancestors understood the relationship between space and sound, that they recognized certain locations as special, as places where sound behaved in magical ways, and that they marked these places as significant. Imagine standing in one of those caves, deep enough that no natural light penetrates, holding a torch that casts dancing shadows across the painted walls, and playing a flute. The sound would fill the darkness, echoing and reverberating, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. It would transform the cave into a living space, a ceremonial chamber, a temple. Was this religious? Almost certainly, though we must be careful about projecting our own categories onto these ancient practices. But it seems clear that music was connected to the sacred, to attempts to reach beyond the everyday world into something larger, something mysterious As the millennia passed, as the ice slowly retreated and the climate warmed, as human groups began to settle in particular places and develop agriculture, the instruments grew more varied and more sophisticated. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where some of the world's first cities emerged, archaeologists have found lyres, beautiful instruments with wooden frames and strings made from animal gut. Some of these lyres were buried in royal tombs, placed there to accompany the dead into the afterlife, suggesting that music was considered essential not just for earthly life, but for whatever lay beyond. The craftsmanship of these lyres is stunning. The sound boxes are decorated with intricate inlays, precious materials arranged in elaborate patterns. The bridges and tuning mechanisms show sophisticated understanding of how string tension and vibration produce different pitches. This was not primitive technology. This was advanced, refined through generations of luthiers who understood their craft with profound depth. And there is something deeply moving about seeing these instruments, recovered from graves thousands of years old, knowing that the last hands to touch them were hands that lovingly placed them beside a body, hoping perhaps that music would continue in the world to come. In ancient Egypt, the archaeological record reveals an even richer musical landscape. Wall paintings and hieroglyphic texts show us orchestras, groups of musicians playing together with harps and lyres, with flutes and double reed instruments similar to modern oboes, with percussion instruments including drums and sistrums, metal rattles that produced a shimmering, mysterious sound. The Egyptians wrote about music, not in the analytical way that later cultures would, but in ways that reveal how central it was to their conception of the world. Music was performed in temples as offerings to the gods. It accompanied processions and festivals. It was played at banquets and celebrations, and it was considered so important that musicians held honored positions in society, their skill recognized and rewarded. Some of the instruments from ancient Egypt have survived, preserved by the dry climate, and when modern researchers have attempted to recreate them to understand how they sounded, the results are haunting. The tones are different from what our ears expect, tuned to scales that don't quite match the Western musical tradition, and this otherness is itself revealing, reminding us that there are many ways to organize sound, many different paths to beauty across the ancient world, in China and India, in Africa and the Americas. Human cultures were developing their own distinctive musical traditions, their own instruments, their own ways of understanding what music was and what it could do. In ancient China, bells were cast from bronze using techniques of extraordinary sophistication. These were not simple bells, but instruments tuned to precise pitches, arranged in sets that could play melodies. Some of these bells were massive, requiring multiple people to strike them, and they were used in rituals that linked earthly rulers to cosmic order. The sound of the bells, deep and resonant and long-lasting, was thought to harmonize earth and heaven. In India, the ancient texts speak of music as one of the fundamental forces of the universe. The Vedas, composed perhaps 3,000 years ago or more, describe musical instruments and their uses in ceremonies. They mention stringed instruments similar to the modern sitar, drums of various kinds, and wind instruments, and they articulate a philosophy of music that connects specific sounds and scales to emotional states, to times of day, to seasons, to spiritual conditions. This idea that music is not arbitrary, but has inherent meanings and effects, that different modes or scales naturally evoke different feelings, would become central to Indian musical theory and would influence musical thinking across much of Asia. In Africa, the diversity of musical instruments was perhaps greater than anywhere else on earth. Each region, each culture group developed its own instruments suited to their materials, their aesthetic preferences, their ceremonial needs. There were drums of countless varieties, from small hand drums to massive ceremonial drums that could be heard for miles. There were thumb pianos, instruments with metal tines mounted on a wooden board that produced delicate, melodic sounds when plucked. There were xylophones made from gourds and wooden bars, wind instruments fashioned from horns and tusks, and crucially, these instruments were not solitary. African musical tradition emphasized ensemble playing, multiple instruments working together in complex polyrhythmic patterns, creating textures of sound that were intricate and layered. This approach to music, this emphasis on collective creation rather than individual performance, would eventually travel across the ocean, carried by enslaved people to the Americas, where it would help give birth to jazz and blues and countless other musical forms. But I am moving too quickly, getting ahead of the story. In these ancient times, before empires, before global trade, before any conception that the earth was round or that other continents existed, each culture developed its musical instruments in relative isolation, shaped by available materials, by aesthetic, celtic values, by the purposes music served in their particular society. Wood and bone, hide and horn, gut and reed, these were the primary materials, and from them human ingenuity crafted an astonishing variety of forms. The technical understanding required was considerable. To make a stringed instrument that produces a clear tone, you must understand tension and vibration. You must know how the length and thickness of a string affects its pitch, how the resonance of the body amplifies and colors the sound. To make a wind instrument, you must understand how air moving through a column produces tone, how the length of that column determines pitch, how finger holes can change the effective length. This knowledge was empirical, learned through trial and error, through careful observation, through the accumulated wisdom of many generations. No one wrote it down in these early times. It lived in the hands and ears of the makers, passed from master to apprentice, from parent to child, and slowly, over centuries and millennia, the instruments evolved. Each generation made small refinements, experimenting with different shapes, different materials, different construction techniques, and the successful innovations were retained, incorporated into the tradition, while the failures were forgotten. This is evolution in the truest sense, not biological evolution, but cultural evolution, the gradual refinement of human tools and techniques through selection and inheritance. By the time the great classical civilizations emerged in Greece and Rome, musical instruments had already undergone thousands of years of development, and they had become sophisticated, varied, and deeply integrated into the fabric of social life. The Greeks had a word for this integration. They called it musiki, and it encompassed not just music as we understand it, but poetry, dance, theater, all the arts governed by the muses. Music was not a separate category of experience, but woven into education, into religious ritual, into civic celebrations, into the very definition of what it meant to be cultured and civilized. The primary stringed instrument of ancient Greece was the lyre, an instrument of such importance that it became a symbol of Greek culture itself. The lyre had a resonating body, often made from a tortoise shell, with two arms extending upward, connected by a crossbar. Strings, usually 7 of them, stretched from the crossbar down to the body, and were plucked with the fingers or with a plectrum. The sound of the lyre was delicate, intimate, suited to accompanying poetry and song, and the Greeks believed that learning to play the lyre was essential to education. It taught rhythm and proportion. It cultivated the soul. It created harmony within the individual that reflected the cosmic harmony of the spheres. For the Greeks had a profound philosophy of music. They believed that different modes, different scales, and tonal organizations had different ethical effects. The Dorian mode produced courage and steadfastness. The Phrygian mode aroused passion and enthusiasm. The Lydian mode softened the soul and made it receptive to pleasure. Plato, in his Republic, went so far as to argue that certain musical modes should be banned from the ideal city because they would produce the wrong kind of character in the citizens. This seems strange to modern ears. This idea that a particular arrangement of tones could shape moral character, but it reveals something important about how deeply the Greeks understood music as a force, not just entertainment, but something that acted upon the soul at a fundamental level. Alongside the lyre, the Greeks played the aulos, a double reed instrument similar to an oboe, but usually played in pairs, one pipe in each hand. The aulos had a completely different character from the lyre. Its sound was penetrating, wild, ecstatic. It was associated with the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy and transformation, and with the kind of music that loosened control, that allowed the irrational to emerge. And here we see something fascinating. The same culture maintaining two very different musical traditions, one Apollonian, ordered, rational, represented by the lyre, the other Dionysian, chaotic, emotional, represented by the aulos. Both were valued. Both had their place, but they represented different aspects of human experience, different ways of being in the world. The Romans inherited much of Greek musical culture, but they also expanded it, made it more spectacular, more public. Roman festivals featured enormous ensembles, hundreds of musicians playing together. The Romans developed the hydraulis, the water organ, a remarkable instrument that used water pressure to maintain steady air flow through pipes of different lengths, producing sustained tones of considerable volume. The hydraulis was a marvel of engineering, requiring understanding of pneumatics and hydraulics, of pipe construction and valve mechanisms. It was played in amphitheaters, in circuses, at public games. Its sound could fill vast spaces, could be heard over the roar of crowds, and it represented something new, the application of mechanical principles to music making, the beginning of a long tradition of increasingly complex musical machines. But as the Roman Empire slowly fragmented and a new world emerged from its ruins, as Christianity spread across Europe and reshaped cultural life, the role of musical instruments underwent a profound transformation. The early church was ambivalent about instruments. The human voice, singing in unison, was considered the purest form of worship. Instruments, with their associations with pagan festivals and theatrical performances, with secular entertainment, were viewed with suspicion for centuries. Church music was almost exclusively vocal, the great Gregorian chants echoing through stone cathedrals, unaccompanied by any instrument except, eventually, the organ. The organ was different. It was powerful enough to fill the largest church. It could sustain tones indefinitely, creating a sound that seemed almost supernatural. And importantly, it was fixed in place. It belonged to the church building itself. It was not portable like other instruments, not associated with wandering musicians and worldly pleasures. The development of the organ through the medieval period is one of the great stories of musical instrument evolution. Early organs were relatively simple, but by the Gothic period, they had become enormously complex. Some had multiple keyboards, stops that could change the tone color, pedals that allowed the organist to play bass notes with the feet, ranks upon ranks of pipes, some as tall as a person, some as small as a pencil, each producing a different timbre. Building an organ was a massive undertaking, requiring years of work by specialized craftsmen. The pipes had to be precisely made. The action that connected the keys to the valves had to be smooth and reliable. The wind supply had to be steady and sufficient. An organ builder needed to understand acoustics, metallurgy, carpentry, mechanics. It was one of the most technically demanding crafts of the medieval world. And when a great organ was completed, when it first sounded in a cathedral, it must have seemed miraculous. The building itself became an instrument, the stone walls and vaulted ceilings shaping and amplifying the sound, creating effects that were impossible in any other context. The music seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the space completely, and the congregation standing in that sound must have felt themselves transported, lifted out of ordinary experience into something transcendent, outside the churches, in the castles and manor houses, in the town squares and village greens. A different musical world was flourishing. Minstrels and troubadours wandered from place to place, carrying instruments that were portable and versatile. The lute became the dominant instrument of this secular tradition, descended from the Arabic oud, brought to Europe through Spain and the Crusades. The lute had a pear-shaped body and a bent-back neck, strung with courses of strings, pairs tuned to the same pitch, that were plucked with the fingers. Its sound was warmer and richer than the ancient lyre, capable of playing both melody and harmony, both single-note lines and chords. It could accompany a singer or stand alone as a solo instrument, and it became the instrument of choice for educated amateurs and professional musicians alike. The craftsmanship that went into a fine lute was extraordinary. The body was built from thin strips of wood, ribs bent and shaped and glued together to form the rounded back. The soundboard, the flat top, was made from carefully selected spruce, carved to a precise thickness that varied across its surface, thicker in some areas for strength, thinner in others for resonance. The neck was shaped to fit the hand comfortably, fretted with strips of gut tied around it at carefully measured intervals. A master lute maker needed years of training, needed to understand how different woods behaved, how humidity affected tone, how the bracing inside the soundboard influenced the way it vibrated. This was knowledge that could not be written down fully. It lived in the hands, in the eye, in the ear that could hear whether an instrument was balanced and true. and the same was true for makers of other instruments. The craft guilds that formed in medieval cities, organizations of violin makers in Cremona, of organ builders in Germany, of flute makers in France, these guilds carefully guarded their knowledge, passing it down through formal apprenticeships that lasted years. A boy, and it was almost always boys, would enter a master's workshop at age 12 or 13 and would spend the next 7 or 8 years learning every aspect of the craft, starting with the simplest tasks and gradually taking on more responsibility, more complex work. By the time an apprentice completed his training and became a journeyman, he carried within him the accumulated wisdom of generations. He knew things about wood and glue and varnish that had been learned through centuries of trial and error. He could feel when a piece was right, when the thickness of a soundboard was perfect, when the curve of a rib was true, and this knowledge, embodied and intuitive, made possible the creation of instruments of stunning beauty and power. The Renaissance brought an explosion of new instruments and new possibilities as trade expanded and wealth accumulated, as courts became centers of cultural competition and display. There was unprecedented demand for music and for musicians, and this demand drove innovation. New instruments appeared or were refined from earlier forms. The viol family developed, instruments played with a bow like the modern violin, but held between the legs or on the lap, with frets like a lute, producing a softer, more intimate sound. The recorder became standardized, a wooden flute with a gentle, pure tone, easy enough for amateurs to play but capable of great expressiveness in skilled hands. The harpsichord emerged, a keyboard instrument where the strings were plucked by quills when the keys were pressed, capable of intricate contrapuntal music, of the complex interwoven melodies that Renaissance composers loved. And most importantly, the violin family began to take its modern form. The violin, viola, and cello, instruments that would come to dominate Western art music for the next 4 centuries, were perfected in the workshops of northern Italy, in Cremona and Brescia, by makers whose names are still spoken with reverence: Amati, Stradivari, Guarneri. These makers discovered something profound about the relationship between form and sound. They found that the arch of the top and back plates, the exact placement of the sound post inside the body, the thickness graduation of the wood, the varnish applied to the surface, all of these factors interacted in complex ways to determine the tone quality, the volume, the responsiveness of the instrument, and they achieved a level of perfection that has arguably never been surpassed. A Stradivarius violin made in 1708 or 1714 still sounds glorious, still outperforms most modern instruments, still sells for millions of dollars. How did they do it? What did they know that we have forgotten? These questions haunt instrument makers to this day. Some believe it was the wood, that the particular trees growing in the Little Ice Age had denser, more resonant growth rings. Others point to the varnish, suggesting secret formulas now lost. Still others argue it was the accumulated skill, the result of multiple generations of refinement, of makers who did nothing else their entire lives but try to make the perfect violin. Whatever the answer, these instruments represent a pinnacle. They show us what is possible when craft knowledge deepens over generations, when a community of makers shares insights and competes to exceed each other. when cultural values align to support and reward the pursuit of excellence, the 18th century brought new forces into play, forces that would transform not just musical instruments, but the entire social and economic fabric of the world. The scientific revolution had revealed nature as a system governed by mathematical laws. The Enlightenment proclaimed reason as the highest faculty, and the Industrial Revolution began to replace handcraft with machine production. These transformations touched musical instruments in profound ways. The piano emerged during this period, and its development tells us much about the age. The harpsichord, for all its brilliance, had a fundamental limitation. No matter how hard or soft you pressed a key, the volume remained the same, because the mechanism simply plucked the string. But the piano, originally called the pianoforte, the soft loud, used hammers that struck the strings, and the force of the hammer blow could be controlled by the player's touch. This meant that for the first time, a keyboard instrument could be expressive in a new way, could sing, could whisper, could thunder, could shape phrases with dynamic nuance. The piano gave the player direct control over emotion, over the intensity of each individual note. The early pianos were delicate instruments, their frames made of wood, their strings relatively thin. Their sound was lighter than the modern piano, more transparent, closer in some ways to the harpsichord they were replacing. But makers were constantly experimenting, making the instruments larger, stronger, more powerful. The Broadwood Company in London, the Arar firm in Paris, makers in Vienna and across the German states, they competed to create instruments that could fill larger concert halls, that could project over orchestras, that could satisfy the demands of virtuoso performers who were becoming celebrities in their own right. By the 1820s and 1830s, the piano had become the dominant instrument of middle-class musical life. Every educated family aspired to own one. Piano playing was considered an essential accomplishment for young women, a mark of refinement and culture, and this enormous demand transformed piano manufacturing from a craft into an industry. Factories appeared, employing hundreds of workers, dividing the labor into specialized tasks. One group would prepare the soundboards, another would string the instruments, another would install the actions, the complex mechanisms that connected keys to hammers. The principles of mass production were being applied to what had once been entirely handmade objects. And yet, even in the factories, there remained aspects of the work that required human judgment, voicing the hammers, adjusting their hardness and shape to achieve the desired tone, regulating the action so that every key responded identically, finishing the cabinet work. These tasks still demanded the trained ear and hand, the accumulated experience that could not be reduced to mechanical procedure. The violin underwent its own transformation during this period. The old instruments made by the Italian masters were increasingly recognized as superior, but they were being modified. Their necks were lengthened and angled back more steeply. The bass bar inside was made larger. The bridge was made higher. All of these changes increased the string tension, made the instruments louder and more brilliant, more suitable for the concert halls that were replacing the intimate chambers where they had originally been played. This reveals something important about musical instruments. They are not static, even when an instrument achieves a classic form. It continues to evolve in response to changing musical and social needs. The violin that Stradivari made is not quite the same as the violin we hear in concert halls today. Though it bears his name, wind instruments were also evolving rapidly. The development of the valve system for brass instruments, beginning in the early 1800s, was particularly revolutionary. Before valves, trumpets and horns could only play the notes of the harmonic series in whatever key the instrument was built. They could play fanfares and simple melodies, but not chromatic scales, not the full range of notes that other instruments commanded. Valves changed this completely. By pressing different combinations of valves, the player could instantly change the length of the tube, could access any note in the chromatic scale. Suddenly, brass instruments could play any melody, could participate fully in the orchestra as melodic instruments, rather than just providing harmonic support and rhythmic punctuation. The technical ingenuity required to develop reliable valve systems was considerable. The valves had to redirect the airflow instantly, had to seal perfectly, had to be durable and maintainable. It took decades of experimentation before the modern piston valve emerged. But once it did, it opened up entirely new possibilities for composers and performers. The woodwind family underwent similar developments. The Boehm system for the flute, developed in the 1830s and 1840s, used a complex arrangement of keys and rods to allow the fingers to control holes that were too far apart to reach directly. This allowed the holes to be positioned in their acoustically ideal locations, and it made previously difficult passages smooth and comfortable to play. Similar systems were developed for the clarinet and oboe. Each instrument presented its own challenges, its own peculiar acoustical characteristics that had to be understood and accommodated. But the general principle was the same: to use mechanical advantage to overcome the limitations of human anatomy, to allow the instrument to be what it needed to be acoustically, while still remaining playable. These innovations required collaboration between performers who understood what was musically necessary and craftsmen who understood what was mechanically possible. The makers needed to listen to the players, and the players needed to understand enough about acoustics and mechanics to communicate their needs clearly. It was a dialogue, a back and forth that gradually refined the instruments to higher and higher levels of capability. The 19th century saw the rise of the virtuoso, the performer as artist and celebrity, Paganini on the violin, Liszt on the piano. These were figures who pushed their instruments to extremes, who developed techniques that seemed almost supernatural, and their demands drove further innovations in instrument design and construction. But the 19th century also saw the beginning of something else, a growing interest in the musical instruments of other cultures, in the vast world of non-Western musical traditions that had developed in parallel with European traditions. European colonial expansion brought direct contact with the musical cultures of Asia, Africa, the Americas, the Pacific Islands, and while much of this contact was exploitative and destructive, while colonialism devastated traditional cultures in countless ways, it also created opportunities for cross-cultural exchange, for European musicians and scholars to encounter instruments and musical concepts entirely different from their own traditions. The gamelan orchestras of Java and Bali, with their bronze metallophones and gongs, playing intricate interlocking patterns that created shimmering fields of sound. The sitar and tabla of India, instruments of incredible sophistication capable of expressing the subtle emotional nuances of raga, the mbira and kora of Africa, the shakuhachi of Japan, the didgeridoo of Australia. Each of these instruments embodied a complete musical philosophy, a different way of organizing sound and time. European instrument museums began to collect these instruments, not always with full understanding, not always with respect for the living traditions they came from, but nevertheless creating repositories of knowledge that would eventually allow for deeper engagement and appreciation. And some composers began to be influenced by these sounds. Debussy heard a gamelan ensemble at the Paris Exposition of 1889 and was profoundly affected. The way the metallophones created harmony through layered melodic patterns rather than through vertical chords, the way rhythm was organized in cycles rather than in linear progressions. These ideas seeped into his own compositional thinking and contributed to the breakdown of traditional harmonic language that characterized early 20th century music. The 20th century brought transformations more radical than any that had come before. The development of electronic instruments, beginning with the theremin in the 1920s and continuing through the synthesizers of the 1960s and beyond, fundamentally changed what was possible. These were not acoustic instruments at all. They generated sound through electronic circuits, through oscillators and filters, and they could produce timbres that no acoustic instrument could match. The electric guitar emerged in the 1930s, developed initially as a solution to a practical problem. Acoustic guitars were simply not loud enough to be heard in big bands and dance orchestras, but the electric guitar became far more than just a louder acoustic guitar. In the hands of players who explored its possibilities, who discovered that amplification could be pushed into distortion to create entirely new tones. It became the voice of rock and roll, of blues, of a musical revolution that would reshape popular culture worldwide. And yet, through all of these changes, acoustic instruments continued to be made and played. The violin, the flute, the piano, instruments whose basic forms had been established centuries earlier, remained central to classical music. Craftspeople still learned the old techniques, still built instruments by hand using methods that would be recognizable to makers from the 18th century. This reveals something profound about the nature of musical instruments. They are technologies, yes, but they are also embodied traditions, repositories of accumulated knowledge and skill, and they are interfaces between the human body and the invisible realm of sound, shaped over generations to fit our hands, our breath, our physical capabilities, in ways that feel natural and right. The story of musical instruments is not a simple progression from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex. It is rather a branching tree of possibilities, each branch representing a different culture's exploration of what sound can be, what music can do, how humans can shape the invisible into the meaningful. And standing in my quiet chamber, surrounded by these instruments from every age and every culture, I begin to see them not as isolated objects, but as nodes in an enormous network of human creativity, each one connected to all the others through threads of influence and inspiration, through the universal human impulse to make music, to transform the raw materials of the earth into vessels for emotion and meaning. The light in the chamber has shifted, grown softer, more diffuse, as if the day outside is drawing toward evening. and I find myself moving more slowly still, pausing longer before each instrument, sensing the weight of time they carry, the countless hands that have held them, the countless ears that have listened. There is a question that emerges from all of this history, a question that hovers in the golden air of this chamber like dust motes suspended in light. Why do we make music at all? What is it about organized sound, about vibrations traveling through air at particular frequencies and in particular patterns, that moves us so deeply, that has driven every human culture without exception to create instruments, to invest time and resources and creative energy into making music? The answer, if there is one, lies somewhere beyond language, in a realm that instruments themselves seem to access. Music exists in time, but not in the way that speech exists in time. Words follow one another in linear sequence, each one carrying a discrete meaning that contributes to an overall message. But music creates a different kind of time, a time that circles and returns, that builds tension and releases it, that can make a moment feel eternal or make an hour disappear. And instruments are the tools we have developed to shape this special kind of time, to make it tangible, to bring it into the world where others can experience it. Each instrument does this in its own way, with its own character, its own voice. A violin sings with a directness that seems almost like speech, its vibrato adding warmth and humanity. A flute soars and floats, ethereal and pure. A drum marks the heartbeat, the pulse, the fundamental rhythm that connects us to our own bodies and to each other. And when instruments play together, when a string quartet weaves four voices into a single fabric, when an orchestra blends dozens of different timbres into a unified sound, something emerges that is more than the sum of the parts. A collective voice, a shared expression that allows individual human beings to participate in something larger than themselves. Perhaps this is part of the answer. Music and the instruments that make it possible create community. They allow us to synchronize, to align our emotions and our attention, to feel together rather than alone. In traditional cultures around the world, music making is rarely a solitary activity. It happens in groups, at ceremonies and celebrations, at moments of collective importance. The instruments serve to bind people together, to mark occasions as significant, to create a shared experience that strengthens social bonds. Even in Western classical tradition, where the image of the solitary genius composing alone in a garret has such power, the music is ultimately meant to be performed, to be heard by others, to create a moment of communion between performer and audience, between the composer who lived perhaps centuries ago and the listeners alive today. The instruments bridge these gaps. They carry the music across time and space. A piano can play a Beethoven sonata more than 200 years after it was written, and if the performer understands the music deeply, if the instrument is well made and properly maintained, something of what Beethoven felt, some quality of his thought and emotion, can be transmitted to listeners who inhabit a completely different world. This is extraordinary when you think about it. These wooden boxes with strings stretched across these metal tubes with keys and valves, these membranes stretched tight over frames, they become time machines, vessels of memory, carriers of human feeling across the centuries, and they accumulate their own histories. A violin played for generations in a family carries not just the notes that are being played now, but somehow, in some ineffable way, the echo of all the notes that have been played on it before. The wood remembers, or perhaps it is we who remember, projecting onto the instrument the weight of its past. But the feeling is real, that a well-used instrument has a depth, a character, that a new one lacks. There is also something profound in the fact that acoustic instruments require human effort, human skill, human breath or hands in direct contact. Electronic instruments can produce sound at the press of a button, can play back recordings with perfect accuracy. But acoustic instruments demand presence. They require the player to be fully engaged, to shape each note through physical action, through breath control or bow pressure or the precise angle of a finger on a string. This creates a different relationship between the musician and the music. The music is not something separate, something reproduced, but something created in the moment, something that requires the musician's complete attention and intention. And this immediacy, this sense that the music is being born right now, creates an intimacy, a vulnerability that recorded or electronic music often lacks. We can hear this in the small imperfections, the slight variations in tone and timing that mark live acoustic performance. These are not flaws, but signs of humanity, evidence that a person is making choices, is responding to the instrument and to the moment, is bringing something of themselves into the sound. And this perhaps is the deepest answer to the question of why we make instruments, why we make music. We do it because we are creatures who need to express what is inside us, who need to communicate things that words cannot carry, who need to create beauty and meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and incomprehensible. The instruments are our allies in this. They extend our capabilities. They allow us to do things our bodies alone cannot do, to produce sounds we could never make with just our voices, to organize time in ways that reveal patterns and structures we might otherwise never perceive. And in learning to play an instrument, in the thousands of hours of practice required to develop real skill, we are changed. Our brains literally rewire themselves, creating new neural pathways, strengthening connections between motor control and auditory perception, between memory and emotion. The instrument becomes almost an extension of the body, the boundary between self and tool blurring until action and sound feel unified, natural, inevitable. This transformation is itself valuable, apart from any music that might result. The discipline of practice, the patience required to master difficult passages, the attention to nuance and detail, these cultivate qualities of mind and character that extend far beyond music. They teach us that excellence requires time, that mastery is a gradual accumulation of small improvements, that beauty emerges from sustained effort and care. The chamber around me feels quieter now, as if the instruments themselves are settling into stillness. The golden light has deepened to amber, to the color of old honey, and I realize that I have been standing here for a long time, letting my gaze move from instrument to instrument, following the threads that connect them across centuries and continents. Each one is silent now, waiting, but the silence is not empty. It is full of potential, full of all the music that has been played on these instruments and all the music that might yet be played. The silence holds the memory of hands long turned to dust and the promise of hands not yet born, who will someday take up these instruments or instruments like them and bring them to life again. There is a cycle here. A maker creates an instrument with knowledge passed down through generations. A player learns to draw music from it through years of practice and study. An audience listens and is moved, and perhaps someone in that audience is inspired to learn, to become a maker or a player themselves, and the cycle continues. Each generation adding its own insights, its own innovations, its own interpretations, but also maintaining continuity with everything that came before. This continuity is precious in a world of constant change where technologies become obsolete almost before they can be mastered, where traditions are forgotten and connections to the past severed. The persistence of musical instruments offers something rare. They carry within them the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. They link us to our ancestors in the most direct way, through shared physical actions, shared aesthetic judgments, shared emotional responses to organized sound. When I play a wooden flute, I am doing something that humans have done for 40,000 years. When I bow a violin, I am participating in a tradition that connects me to makers and players across centuries. When I sit at a piano, I am touching keys that operate mechanisms refined through generations of experimentation and thought. These connections matter. They remind us that we are not alone, not isolated individuals adrift in time, but part of something larger, part of a great human project of making beauty and meaning, a project that began in the darkness of prehistory and continues into a future we cannot imagine. The instruments will outlast us. A well-made violin can play for centuries. A bronze bell can ring for 1,000 years. They carry forward something essential about human creativity and human emotion, and they will be here in chambers like this one, long after we are gone, waiting for new hands, new breath, new intentions to bring them back to life. I take a final slow walk through the chamber, my footsteps silent on the wooden floor. My hand brushes lightly across the curved body of a cello, across the ivory keys of an old harpsichord, across the taut skin of a drum that came from a place whose name I do not know. Each touch is a kind of greeting, a recognition, an acknowledgement of the human hands that shaped these objects and the human hearts that have poured themselves into the music they make possible. The light is fading now, the amber glow becoming softer, more diffuse. The instruments are retreating into shadow, their forms becoming less distinct, merging with the darkness that gathers in the corners of the chamber. But they are still there, still present, still waiting with patient silence for the next moment of music, the next breath, the next touch that will wake them into sound. And I understand now that this chamber, this quiet space filled with instruments from every age, is not really a museum, not really a collection of artifacts from the past. It is a threshold, a place between silence and sound, between past and future, between the solitary self and the community of all who have ever made or listened to music. I can leave this place, can step back out into the world of ordinary time and ordinary concerns, but I will carry something with me, a sense of connection to the long human story of music making, a deeper appreciation for the instruments that make that story possible, and perhaps a renewed awareness of the mystery and the gift of organized sound, of the way it can reach into us and touch something beyond words, beyond thought, something fundamental to what it means to be human. The last light fades, the chamber darkens, the instruments rest in their timeless patience, and the silence that surrounds them is complete and full and somehow musical.